In this course, we're gonna build a Vue application from scratch. And to build this application, we will use so-called Composition API. Also, to style our application, we're gonna leverage the power of CSS framework, Tailwind CSS. And before we start, let's take a look on the final application. The app is called On Track and will allow you to track your activities during the day. For example, for every particular hour in a day, we can specify particular activity. In my case, I don't have any activities yet, so let's switch over to the next tab, Activities. And here we can add some activities. Let's add a few. I'm going to add my activities, that is reading, training, and coding. As we can see, next to every activity item, we see a drop-down where we can choose how much time we'd like to spend on this activity every day. Let's say I would like to read 30 minutes in a day, work out for about 1 hour, and for coding, I will choose 3 hours. And then, from the timeline screen, I can choose any activity that I just added in Activities tab, and then start stopwatch, which is going to track the time for that particular activity. This time will be synced automatically with all 3 tabs at the bottom. When we switch to the second tab, we can see the time for the reading activity is going down. And there is also one more tab called Progress. Here we can see all our activities and our current progress for every activity. We can also see in percentage how much time was spent on all activities in regards to the total amount of time that we have previously chosen for that activity. And those progress bars are also updated in real time. You may have also noticed a little label at the top right corner which says Progress. That number shows our total current progress. And if we complete all our activities, or if there will be no activities at all, then the text of that label will say Day Complete. An activities page will show a placeholder image with a little description. The same goes with the third tab. Here we can also see a placeholder image. So let's get started with installing Vue application. To initialize an empty Vue project, we're gonna run this npm init command in our terminal. Once we run this command, it will ask us a few questions about our project. Since we're going to use pure Composition API without any additional libraries, we're gonna answer no on almost every questions, except last 2. Whenever we are asked if we'd like to use ESLint and Prettier in our project, we're gonna answer yes. Both those tools will help us maintain good code style and formatting. And after this command is done, we're presented with 4 additional commands that we have to run step by step in order to launch our application. Firstly, we're gonna go into our project folder, in my case it is called On Track, and run npm install to install npm dependencies, then run npm run format to format project files, and run npm run dev to run development server. So let's do it. I'm gonna go inside of On Track folder, here install npm dependencies. After all dependencies are installed, we're gonna format project files, and at the end, let's run development server. And eventually we will see the address by which we can access the project in the browser. I'm gonna open this address in Firefox browser, and here I see the default screen for the Vue application. After we made sure that we can access Vue application, it's time to install Tailwind CSS. Let's open up Tailwind CSS docs. Here we will choose the option to install Tailwind in one of the frameworks. In our case, we're using Vite, so open up this page. And on this page, we have to choose option using Vue. And then let's step by step follow the instructions listed on this page. We can skip the first step, since here we need to initialize Vite project. In our case, we have already done so. And on the next step, we need to install a couple of npm dependencies, Tailwind CSS itself, plugin post CSS, as well as autoprefixer. Let's copy these commands, switch over to the terminal, and run them. Besides installing all necessary npm dependencies, these commands will also generate a couple of configuration files. One of them is for Tailwind CSS, called tailwindcss, Another one is for PostCSS, called PostCSS config.js. Let's go to the next step. Here we have to modify the content of Tailwind config.js file by replacing existing option called content. Let's copy the value of this content option from here, go to our editor, open up Tailwind config.js file, replace existing content option with a new one. In this option we have to specify the files where we're gonna use Tailwind CSS classes. And then Tailwind will scan those files and build up resulting style sheet. On the next step, we need to include Tailwind CSS in our CSS file. Let's copy over those three directives, open our main CSS file called main.css, which already contains some initial content. We'll remove everything and leave only those three directives to include Tailwind CSS. And by now everything should be ready to use Tailwind CSS in our project. We just need to start development server by using command npm run dev. In my case, the server is already running, so I need to stop it first by pressing Ctrl+C, and then run it again with npm run dev. And finally, let's check if Tailwind CSS classes will work. We will copy the following code snippet, which already contains a couple of Tailwind CSS classes. And then, inside of editor, let's open up the main component called app.vue. We don't need any default content, so let's remove everything inside of this file and leave only that code that we have just copied. And now in the browser, if we're gonna see the Hello World heading with an underline, that means that Tailwind CSS classes are properly applied, so Tailwind CSS was successfully installed. Now let's do a few more installations that are going to simplify our development. Firstly, we install VS Code extension called Prettier. This is the formatter which is gonna help us format our code inside of VS Code. I do not see this install button since I have already installed this extension before. And also for better Vue support in VS Code, we're gonna install one more extension called Vue Language Features or Volar. This extension is gonna provide Vue IntelliSense features. I already have this Volar extension installed, so I just need to enable it. And now let's see if formatting is working properly. In the command panel of VS Code, let's run command called format document with. Here we just choose a preferred formatter, and as we can see, the file was properly formatted. And since we're gonna use a lot of Tailwind CSS classes in template files, it will be good if formatter could also sort those classes for us. Luckily, there is a plugin for Prettier called Prettier Plugin Tailwind CSS. This plugin will automatically sort Tailwind CSS classes whenever we will apply formatting with Prettier. So let's install this plugin. Now let's see if our classes will be sorted properly. We'll change the order of classes in here. And now if I press keyboard shortcut to format this file, we will notice that class order was also changed. At the end of this lesson, let's remove extra files from our project. We'll remove the following files: base.css, logo.svg. We don't need all components located inside of icons folder. Let's completely remove this folder, as well as remove these three components: hello world, the welcome, and welcome item. And now we end up with only one CSS file, main.css, that only has directives to include Tailwind CSS. The components folder is currently empty. We only have one main component called app.vue. Before finishing up, let's also install helpful extension to develop Vue applications called vuejs DevTools. I use browser Firefox, so I search for add-on called Vue DevTools, and from here we can install Vuejs developer tools in Firefox browser. For me, it's already installed. And to check if it works, let's open up DevTools. And here we should see additional tab called Vue, which is that extension Vue DevTools. And with that, we're finishing up this lesson and continue development in the next one. Repository link for this project will be in the video description. Let's make sure development web server is running and our application is available by the address localhost 5173. And now we are ready to start development. Firstly, let's figure out what happens when we load this address in a browser. And the file which gets loaded is called index.html. Here we can see that the script with the name main.js is included on this page. And this is the script where our Vue application gets loaded. Let's open up this file. Firstly, we see the import of the function createApp from Vue package. Later, we're gonna use this function to initialize Vue application. Then comes another import, which imports main component of the application with the name app.vue. This is that component which currently gets displayed in Vue Developer Tools. After that, we import our style sheet, which only contains directives to include Tailwind CSS. And the last instruction is where we initialize and mount Vue application in a container with an ID of app. The element with this ID exists in the file index.html. So once this instruction is executed, all content that is contained within root component app.vue will be rendered on the page. That's what we see right here. And to inspect the markup of this component, we can click on this button and we'll see the exact markup that was rendered by this component. Now we don't need this heading anymore. Let's return to the app.vue, remove this content, and start designing our application. Let's create header, which will contain the anchor tag with our logo. Logo will be represented by an image tag. I have already placed file with a logo in assets folder. And also let's add an alternate text to this image and check out how this looks in the browser. And we can see our logo. Next, let's add another anchor tag below the image. It will be a label which is going to say day complete. But we'll have to position this element next to an image on the right side. And just to make it easier for us to see the whole picture, let's add some dummy content at the bottom of this page. Alright, now we got some content. Let's start adding classes to the header. Firstly, we're gonna stick this header to the top of the page, so it's always displayed while scrolling. Let's add class called sticky. To stick it to the top, add class top0. And to increase the index of this element, we'll add class z20. Let's take a look on the page. Here we can see that the header has become sticky. And now let's position both elements, image and label, on one line. To do so, we can add a class flex to the header. And then just to decrease the height of an image, let's add a class h9 to the image tag. Next, we're gonna apply vertical alignment to the elements in the header by adding class itemCenter. And to place these elements by sides, we add class justifyBetween, which corresponds to CSS property justify content with value space between. After that, we can add a little border to this header by using class border-b, make a background color white, and add a little spacing on all sides with the class p3. This class corresponds to CSS property padding. So far so good, as we can see. And now let's add an icon in a header. For icons, we're gonna use a library called Hero Icons. It has two versions, for React and for Vue applications. We're gonna use version for Vue. To install this library in our project, let's copy over this npm install instruction and run it in our project root. Every icon from this library is represented by the Vue component. And first of all, to use custom component in another component, we gotta use tag script. In our case, since we also use Composition API, we should add a special attribute called setup, which will activate Composition API. And then we just simply have to import icon component within this file, just like we do with other ES6 modules. And the particular icon that we need is called the check circle icon. And to get the proper path for this import, let's get back to the GitHub page and copy it from here. And now let's see how the icon we're gonna use looks like. I'm gonna type the name of the icon in the search field on Hero Icons website, and we can see which icon corresponds to this name. It's a simple check mark. And in this way, we can use any icon name from here, But while importing components that correspond to these icons, we also have to add suffix icon to every icon name. So this is why I have used the name check circle icon to import this component. And then every component that gets imported within another Vue component can be used as a normal HTML tag within the template. Let's use this icon on the page, right below the label day complete. At the same time, we're gonna manually specify the height for this icon. Let's use class h7. Now let's position these elements on one line. To do so, we're gonna make this div flexible container by using class flex, align elements within this container vertically in the center, and specify the distance between child elements in this container with the class gap1. And also, if we take a look at the Vue DevTools on the right side, we can also see that our app component uses custom component called checkCircleIcon. Just to make it look prettier, let's add a class which is gonna assign the color to this icon. We'll use green. And we're also going to decrease the font size for this label. Assign a class to the whole wrapper, text small. And after we have done that, we're gonna add one more label right below the label day complete, which is going to have the same wrapper with exact same classes. But the text will be different. In this case, we'll type progress. And to show the progress value in the percentage, we're gonna use another tag span just to change the font for this particular value. We're gonna use monospaced font. To do so, let's add a class font-mono. And also right next to this label, we're gonna display a little circle, which will correspond to the status of our current progress. And to make it circle, we're gonna assign the same height and width, 3 units, fully round this square to make it circle. And for now, let's use the color for this circle, red 500. And here it is, we get 2 labels displayed at the same time. But in our case, there should be only one label displayed at once. And to conditionally show a particular element in Vue, we can use Vue directive called VIF. This directive expects JavaScript expression, and for now I'm just going to put here true. And based on this condition, Vue decides whether to show this element or to hide it. And there is also another additional directive which is used in combination with VIF. This directive is called VElse, and it should be placed right after the element where VIF directive is used, so that both these elements have to be siblings. And now if we're going to take a look at our page, we're gonna see only one label, the one where VIF directive contains true value. And just to make sure, let's see if this label is gonna be hidden when we change this condition to false. In this case, the next block with VElse should be shown instead. And as we can see, it works as expected. And now let's remove the rest of the dummy content from this page and keep only the header. We're gonna continue in the next lesson. After we've finished adding header on the page, it's time to work on the navigation bar. The high-level structure of our page is represented by 3 main elements: the header element, the main content area, and the navigation bar. Let's get started. In the editor, let's open up our main component app.vue. At the bottom of this page, we're gonna add the area for our main content, represented by the main tag, with some dummy data inside. And right after, we're gonna add nav element. This will represent our navigation. And now, in order to see our navigation, we're gonna have to scroll the page to the very bottom. But we'll have to see the navigation all the time, fixed at the bottom. In order to do this, we're gonna have to add a few classes to the wrapper element, which wraps our header, main area, and navigation. And the element which wraps all these 3 elements is located inside of index.html. This is our div with an ID of app. Here we're gonna add a few classes. Let's make this block flexible container by using flex class. And also we'll make the main axis for this flexible container the vertical axis. And while we're here, let's also edit a title. Change it on track. After that, let's go back to the app.vue and start applying classes to the now. We're gonna make these elements sticky to the bottom by using class bottom0. Also will increase the index, make background color white, and increase font. And in the browser, while scrolling this page, we can see that navigation always stays visible. Let's also see what happens when we're gonna decrease amount of content in the main content area. Get back to the browser, and as you can see, whenever there is not enough content in the main area to cover the whole screen, navigation is shown right below the content. But we need to show this navigation always fixed at the bottom. And to do just that, firstly, let's go to the index.html and use one more class for the element with an ID of up. Just to make the minimum height of this container be equal to the whole screen height, we'll apply the class with the name min_h_screen. And since all elements within this flexible container are flex elements, we're gonna have to stretch one of them so it covers the whole available area in this container. We have to do this with our main area, so for the element main, we'll apply a few more classes. Also make this element flexible, and to make it grow and cover all available space, we'll use class flexGrow. And the main axis of this flexible element will also be vertical. Let's take a look what we have, and now we got a desired result. Navigation was moved to the bottom of the page. Let's add more content to the main area, so we could scroll the page. And even while scrolling the page, navigation stays at the same place, at the bottom. And now time to add links to our navigation. Let's go back to the editor, and inside of navigation, we're gonna add a following markup, unordered list with one list item. And here we're gonna place one link, which will say timeline. This will be our main page. Then let's duplicate the markup for the first list item and paste 2 times. The second page will be activities, and the last page will be progress. And that class which was previously used to increase the font size of the now bar, we're gonna remove. Let's look at the browser, and we can see those 3 links inside of navigation. But we'll have to position those links next to each other on one line. To do this, we're gonna make UL element flexible container, align elements vertically in a center, and add equal spacing between those links. And here's what we got after applying those styles. Let's also add a little border at the top of this navigation. And temporarily also add borders for every list item by using class border. And now we can see that there is no padding between the border and link text. So we're gonna have to add extra spacing to links so that they will cover all available space within their parent container. And to make flexible element stretch, let's apply class flex1. We'll have to apply it for every list item. After that, we can see that the link text was aligned to the left. So to position it in a center, we'll apply a few more classes to the anchor element. We're gonna make this element flexible container. The main axis will be vertical, and to center everything within this container, we'll use class items center. Also, we'll add a little bit of padding and decrease font size. And to make the first letter of the label uppercase, we'll use another Tailwind CSS class called capitalize. And now let's apply exact same classes to the rest of links. We don't need extra borders, we can remove border classes. And also we will use lowercase letters within these links. And here we go, here's what we get at the moment. Our navigation is almost ready. Let's get back to the editor and use appropriate anchors within href attributes. First link will contain word timeline, the second link will contain word activities, and the third link will contain word progress. And now it's time to add icons within every link. We use icons from the side hero icons. In here we just type in the icon name we wish to use. Please note that I also use outline type of icons. So let's go back to the code and add instruction to import our new icon. In this case, we're going to use a little bit different path to import this icon since we use outline type. So we use here word outline, and the icon name will be clock icon. And in our template, next to the label timeline, we're going to use our new component, clock icon. And as we can see, clock icon appeared. So now let's import the rest of icons. We're going to use list bullet icon and chart bar icon. And following exact same steps, in the template, let's use appropriate icons next to every label. Second icon is list bullet icon, and the third one is chart bar icon. And now that we got all icons on our page, it's time to decrease their size. It is very easy to do by using Tailwind CSS classes for height and width. We're gonna use 6 units. And now let's copy over those classes and apply them to other icons. And just like that, markup for our navigation is ready. Let's also see how our page will look like without any content. Let's remove everything from the main element. And this is what we have so far. Let's continue development in the next lesson. In Vue Developer Tools, currently we see that our main component, app, contains 4 additional icon components. One icon inside of the header, and other icons represent menu items within navigation bar. But if we take a closer look at the markup of our navigation inside of app.vue, we can see that markup which represents every menu item is almost identical. Only some parts of it are different, such as icon, text, and the value of href attribute. And right now we're gonna try to improve it somehow. Let's copy one menu item and comment out the rest. In the script area of this component, we're gonna create local constant called navItems. This constant is gonna hold all our page names, timeline activities, and progress. And now, based on this array, we're gonna try to generate markup for every menu item. And for this, we'll need to use another Vue directive called Vue4. This directive lets you iterate over data structures, such as arrays and objects, and based on that, repeatedly generate markup of that element on which this directive is used. Here we're gonna write the following notation. This means that we're gonna loop over items within navItems array, and on every loop iteration we're gonna get one value from this array in page variable, which means that this markup will be rendered as many times how many elements we have inside of navItems array. In the browser we can see that our navigation now shows 3 identical menu items, and on the right side we can also see that our main component now holds one local variable, our array of page names. And now let's do the following. Firstly, let's move href attribute at the very beginning of the anchor tag, and we're going to use the value of page variable as the value for this href attribute. In other words, we have to interpolate value of page variables into this href attribute. We can do this in a usual way, just like it's done in JavaScript, by using template strings. But in order to tell Vue that this is not a simple string, but a JavaScript expression, we're gonna have to bind this value to the href attribute. And we do this with the help of another Vue directive called vbind. And now if we in the browser inspect the DOM structure of every link element, we can see that the href attribute will be different for every link. For the first link, it will say timeline. For the second link, it's going to say activities, and so on. And that means that our interpolation works properly. And now let's make it so every link will show appropriate label. To do this, we will also use interpolation, but in a little bit different way. Since in this case we're gonna have to interpolate value into the content of tag. For such cases, Vue uses syntax of double curly braces, inside of which can be any valid JavaScript expression. But for our needs, it is enough to just use variable name in here, page. And sure enough, every menu item will have an appropriate label. And now let's talk about another important thing related to v-for directive. It is considered a good practice to always use v-for directive along with attribute key. This is a special Vue attribute which Vue will use internally to properly render DOM elements, so it can properly match array elements which we iterate with corresponding DOM elements to avoid any potential rendering issues. And the value of this attribute should be unique for every rendered element. In our case, as a value here, we can simply use variable name page, since all page names in array now items are unique. And now we just need to render proper icon for every menu item, because currently all items render clock icon. So to fix it, we're gonna do the following. Use already familiar Vue directive v-if. Here we check if the current value of the page variable equals to timeline. We're gonna show one icon. On the next element, we're gonna use another Vue directive called v-else-if. It has the same purpose as the corresponding JavaScript instruction else-if. So here we compare page variable with the value activities. And eventually, if none of these conditions are met, we're gonna render icon which corresponds to our progress page. We will use here directive v-else. And now let's go over through the flow one more time. Here we iterate over the array now items, which contains all page names. And on every loop iteration, we're going to render markup for particular now item. And of course, page variable on every loop iteration will be different. And let's not forget and use appropriate icon component names in the second and third cases. And finally, in the browser, we get exactly same result as before, with an exception that now we use more appropriate solution to render list elements by using v-for directive. At the end, let's go back to the editor, remove all commented markup, and finish the lesson. In the previous lesson, we were rendering icons in the navigation bar by using v-for directive. But for our case, there is also another way, which is more compact, which will do the same thing. And we are going to implement this approach right now. Let's go back to the main component app.vue, scroll down to the place where we render icons. And here, what we are gonna do this time is use special Vue component called component. This is so-called dynamic component, which accepts component name in its attribute is that should be rendered in the place of this dynamic component. And since we're gonna need to render icons here, let's specify one of the icons name, clock icon, and also right here we can specify additional classes for this icon. We'll use classes for height and width, but component name clock icon isn't actually a string. It is a component object which we have imported right here. So we have to dynamically bind this JavaScript value to the attribute is. And to do so in Vue, we use vbind directive, or its shorthand form, by using colon. And now if we're gonna take a look in the browser, we're gonna see that exact same icon was rendered 3 times. Because we had 3 loop iterations. Let's fix that, but before we're gonna use interpolation in here and print correct page name by using curly braces. And now inside of this is attribute, we have to specify the value, which will be different on every loop iteration. For this we're gonna use icon variable, and then let's change data structure that is stored inside of this navItems variable. Right now it contains basic JavaScript array, but for our current needs, we're gonna replace it with object, where every key will be a page name, and the corresponding value will be icon component. And this way we're going to have a mapping between page names and their corresponding icons. And thankfully, v-for directive in Vue also allows us to iterate over object properties. The first variable here will store value of the particular key of the objects that we iterate over. And as a second value, we can also specify key itself, which in our case corresponds to page names. And now on every loop iteration, we're gonna have access to the page name and its corresponding icon that we have to render inside of navbar. And as you can see in the browser, we got exact same result as before. All 3 navbar icons have been properly rendered. And also local variable nowItems, which is inside of app component, now contains an object. And our current solution now, by using dynamic component, contains only one line, versus the previous solution, which had 3. Let's remove the previous solution and continue in the next lesson. When it comes to Vue application development, the whole application UI should be split by multiple pieces, and those pieces are self-contained components, which we'll be able to reuse multiple times. Currently in our application there is only one root component called app, which contains everything: header, navigation bar, as well as main application area. And in this lesson we're going to try to split this UI by multiple pieces. For example, we can create separate components for header and navigation. To do this, let's switch back to the editor. Here we'll find markup of the header, cut it from here. And on this place we're gonna use custom component which we'll soon create, called the header. And the reason why I used prefix the in the component name. This is one of the recommendations when it comes to naming Vue components. And in case some component will be used on the page only once, it is recommended to start the name with the prefix the. And this way, by just looking at the component name, we will know that components with prefix the are used only once on the page. And now let's go ahead and create Vue component. We'll create new file called the header with extension .vue. This is a special extension for Vue single file components. In here we're gonna create new template tag, where we will paste markup for the header. In Vue single file components, template tags are used to store markup of the component. And now, since we have created new file for custom component, it's time to import this component from that component where it will be used. So we'll go back to the app component. Here we'll add another import statement and import the header component. This component is located within components folder, and we can see that one of the imports in here is no longer used. That is import of this icon component. Check circle icon. And we have to move this import into our custom component, the header. So go back to the header file. Here we add script tag. We'll also use setup keyword in here. This will be a sign to Vue that we're gonna use Composition API. And right here we're gonna paste import of that icon component. And since we no longer need this import within app component, we'll remove it from here. Also, let's tweak a little bit the path to the logo. Since the header component is contained within components folder, we should firstly leave this folder to access assets folder in this path. And now, just by looking at the Vue developer tools, we see our custom component, the header. And on the right side, we can also see that this component uses custom icon component. Check circle icon. And now we're gonna do the same steps to move markup of navigation within its own component. Let's go back to the app component. Here we're gonna find markup of navigation, cut it from here, and use component with the name the nav. Just like before, I used prefix the in the name of this component, since we're gonna have only one navigation on the page. So let's create the file for this component with the same name, the nav. Here we'll create template tag and paste the component markup. Then, as always, to use custom component, we have to firstly import this component. Let's add an import for the nav component right here. And let's take this whole script tag and move it to the nav component. In here, we're gonna remove unnecessary imports. And after that, some of the imports can also be removed from app component. For example, import of these 3 icon components, because we no longer directly reference these components from within app component. So let's remove this import, as well as the definition of this object nowItems that describes our navigation structure, because this object was also moved inside of the now component. And there we go. Right now we see 2 custom components, the header and the now, that are contained within root component app. We can even go one step further and split header by components. For example, we can create separate components to represent logo, and also one more component to represent progress label on the right. To do this, we'll open up the header component, look for logo markup, cut it from here, logo component is only going to be used once, so the component name will also contain prefix the. Let's go ahead and create a separate file, name it just like component the logo, create template tag and paste component markup. And now let's go back to the header component, and here we add an import for the logo component. In Vue DevTools, we can see that the logo component was added under the header component. So now let's do the same with progress label markup. We're going to create separate component, cut the whole markup of the progress label, use component name the header progress, and follow exact same steps to create new component, starting by creating a new file with template tag and component markup. And now all what's left to do is to import this component from within the header component. Let's add an import right below the logo component. An actually statement that imports check circle icon component should be moved to where it is used, inside of the header component. Let's cut and paste this import inside of the header progress component and finally check everything in the browser. And here is the final result. At the top level we have our root component up, which contains the rest of our components. Up component's markup is split by two components, the header and the nav, and the header component was also split by two components, the logo and the header progress. And this is how we approach development of almost every Vue application, by splitting the whole application UI by several different pieces, called components. In the last lesson we went ahead and split the whole application's UI by several different pieces, components. And today we also create another custom component to represent one nav item. And this nav item component we're going to create will store menu label and menu icon. So using already familiar technique, let's open up the nav component. Here we'll locate markup that is responsible to show nav item. It is this li element. Let's cut it from here and use custom component with the name nav item. Please also note that this time in component's name I haven't used prefix the. Component nav item is gonna be used more than once on one page, since we have three different menu items. So there will exist three such components at the same time. That said, let's create separate file with the name navitem.vue. Here we create template tag and paste components markup. Just to not forget, let's import this component inside of the nav component. And here we face a little problem. Let's take a look at the markup of nav item component. And here we notice that before we used v4 directive on this li element, just to repeatedly render markup of this element several times. But now, since we use custom component to represent every list item, this directive should no longer be specified on this li element. Instead, it should be moved from here and placed directly on nav item component. It's gonna work the same, and markup of nav item component will be rendered several times, depending on how many iterations we're gonna have in v4 loop. Also note that along with v4 directive, I have also moved the attribute key, which is used in combination with v4. And now that this problem is solved, let's go back to the nav item component once again. And here we also use dynamic component, which represents all our nav item icons. But since this nav item component will be a reusable component, which can represent any nav item regardless of an icon and a label, we should be able to specify from outside which icon as well as which label should be used for a particular nav item component. Thankfully, Vue provides us with a way to specify some parts of markup that should be injected within a particular component from outside. And this can be achieved by using a special tag here called slot. And now whatever we're gonna paste in between component tags is automatically going to be injected at the place of this slot tag. We're gonna specify this dynamic component called component in between nav item tags. So nav item component is gonna accept this markup and replace slot element with this specific markup. And visually, as we can see, we don't notice any difference, but in Vue Developer Tools, now we see that the nav component contains three custom components, each one represents nav item. So now let's again open up nowItem component and notice that here inside of markup, we reference undefined variable page as a value for attribute href. And this value should also be configurable from outside, cause it will vary for different nowItem components. Let's move this attribute and place directly on nowItem component where it is used. And by default, Vue will apply all custom attributes that are used on components, like this attribute href. It will apply it directly to component's root element, which in this case is a li element. But instead we need to apply the href attribute to this anchor. So we have to directly specify that this a tag should inherit all the attributes specified on component tags. And we do this by using vbind directive with the special object called $authors. This object will store all attributes specified on component tag. But this is still not enough to make custom attribute inheritance work. Firstly, we should prevent default attribute inheritance, so that component's root element will not inherit any attributes. And to disable such behavior, we have to create a script tag, in this case without setup keyword. This is important, otherwise an option we're gonna use is not going to work. In here we're gonna use a default export to export an object with options. And one option that we need is called inherit authors. And to disable default attribute inheritance, all we have to do is to specify in here value false. So after all that attribute href, which was specified directly on nowItem component, will be automatically transferred and assigned to this anchor element within nowItem component. This is exactly what we told Vue to do by using this vbind directive and disabling default attribute inheritance by using option inherit authors. And after all that, it's finally time to check everything in the browser. By choosing nowItem component, we can see on the right side which attributes it uses. And if we inspect the markup of any nowItem component, sure enough, we will see the href attribute applied directly on the anchor tag. So our custom attribute inheritance works as expected. Now that we have markup of navigation mainly ready, it is time to implement the behavior of automatic highlighting the active menu item. And for that we're going to have to store the name of the currently active page in a variable. Inside of the now component we'll declare new constant called current page to store value of the currently active page. Initial value for this constant will be timeline. And now we're gonna assign another attribute to the nowItem component called class. And we're going to bind value for this attribute by using object notation. Keys of this object will correspond to CSS class names, and the value will be an expression which will evaluate to truthy or falsy. And depending on this value, Vue is gonna decide whether to assign the class specified as a key to this component or not. For example, let's try to assign a class which specifies background color BG gray 200. And since earlier inside of component nowItem we have disabled default attribute inheritance, all attributes that are specified directly on the component tag will automatically be inherited by the element which has this vbind directive with the value of $authors. And as you can see, we already have a few classes defined on this element. So those other classes that are going to be specified from outside inside of this class attribute, they are going to be merged with the rest of classes. Let's just improve this expression a bit. On every loop iteration we're gonna check if page variable equals to current page variable. And if so, we're going to assign class BGGray200 to the current menu item. Let's check it out in Vue DevTools, and right here, when we select the now component on the right side, we can see that the property current page contains the name of the first page, which is timeline. And at the same time, first menu item has gray background. And if we try to change the value of this current page variable, for example, let's use activities. In this case, we'll see that the second menu item is highlighted. So everything works as expected so far, and the class attribute is inherited by the anchor tag within nowItem component. And the next task would be to listen for clicks on this anchor element, so that this nowItem component can send a signal to the parent component, which in this case is the now component. And there is another directive in Vue which lets us bind event listeners. This directive is called VON, And by using colon, we specify which event exactly we'd like to bind listener for. Here we're assigning listener for the click event on the anchor tag. And once this event occurs, whenever user clicks on one of the menu items, we're going to update the value inside of current page variable, which contains the name of the current page. And when this variable gets updated, it will be good that template parts where this variable is used will be also updated automatically to reflect our latest state inside of this component. So ideally, this expression would be evaluated again so that new menu item will get highlighted. Let's see if that works. Initial value of the current page variable is activities, and whenever I start clicking on other menu items, we can see that that value updates. But in the UI, nothing really gets updated, and currently selected menu item is not highlighted. That is because at the time current page variable is normal JavaScript variable, and Vue automatically does not monitor changes within this variable. So we need to use a special Vue function called ref, which we import from the Vue package. And by using this function, we'll be able to make any variable reactive, to make Vue automatically listen for changes inside of such reactive variables. And if such variables will be used inside of template, Vue could automatically re-render DOM structure. So now let's use this ref function to make current page variable reactive. And this function also optionally accepts initial value for this reactive variable. And now that we made this variable reactive, whenever we will modify value inside of this variable, and just because this reactive variable is also used inside of our template, Vue should detect changes in this variable, and based on the new value of this variable, it will automatically re-render certain parts of our template. And in our case, this class bjgrade200 will be applied to the appropriate menu item. And right away in Vue DevTools we can see a little hint that current page variable is a reactive variable. And this time, if we're gonna click on different menu items, we will see that the value of this variable will be updated. And in addition to that, currently selected menu item also gets highlighted. So our reactivity is working and changes to current page variable are reflected in the UI. Let's go back to the editor, and where we used the onDirective, let's use shorthand. And this is more common to specify the onDirective by using such shorthand form. Let's also make another improvement, and that is when some menu item gets selected, we will disable all clicks on this menu item. It is very easy to do by using another Tailwind CSS class called pointer events none. And now when hovering over currently selected item, cursor will remain arrow and will not be changed to the hand pointer. And at the end, let's also see in console what we will get by printing value of the reactive variable. I'm gonna add console log statement in here. Let's take a look in the console. And as you can see, we got not just a primitive string value, but an object, which stores name of the current page in one of its properties. And all reactive variables created by using function ref have property value, where the value of the reactive variable is stored. And by printing this property in the console, we can see the name of the current page. And Vue makes our lives a little easier by allowing us to reference reactive references within templates without having to manually refer to the value property. And to access reactive variables, we could simply use their names inside of template. Let's go back and change the initial value of the current page variable and finish the lesson. Now that we have currently selected menu item highlighted, it will also be good to automatically determine which menu item should be highlighted on the initial page load. And we can do this based on the value of the page hash inside of address bar. But before doing that, let's open up the now component and create separate constants to represent page names. As you can see, currently we use hard-coded page names as keys inside of this nowItems object. But in the future, we're going to reference page names a lot in different files. So it will be beneficial to have constants that will represent page names. And whenever, for example, we would like to rename particular page, we're only going to have to rename one constant value, instead of going through multiple pages and rename every page occurrence. So right here, let's import 3 constants, which we're gonna create soon, to represent every page name our constants will be called page timeline, page activities, and page progress. And here we're following conventions of naming constants and using uppercase register. Let's store constants in a separate file called constants.js. And by the way, whenever importing files with JS extension, this extension can be omitted. So now let's create a file with constants called constants.js. We're going to place this file within source folder. And here we're going to define 3 constants which will represent page names and at the same time export them. Let's make sure we use correct names for every constant. And then go back to the now component. Here we used page names directly to specify keys for nowItems object. But now, since we have separate constants that represent page names, we can use dynamic object properties notation by using square brackets. And instead of hard-coding page names directly, we're going to reference our new constants: page timeline, page activities, and page progress. And as you can see down below, we also have one hard-coded value of the timeline page. Let's just replace this value with appropriate constant, page timeline. But in fact, this is not going to help us in what we're currently trying to do, because we're trying to automatically determine currently selected page based on the page hash value. So first of all, we need to read this value. Let's access location object, then access hash object. This will give us string value of the hash. But this value will also contain a hashtag symbol at the beginning. So we just have to strip this hashtag symbol. For that, let's use slice method and take all characters except the first one. And now let's see if that works. I'm gonna choose progress as the value for the hash. Then refresh the page and let's take a look on the right. What value is stored within current page variable. And indeed, that value was updated based on the page hash. It stores string progress. And also corresponding menu item was highlighted. But now let's see what happens if I'm going to specify page hash, which doesn't correspond to any page. Let's see what happens now after page refresh. And as you can see, none of the menu items was highlighted in this case. So let's also highlight the first menu item. Whenever page hash does not correspond to any existing page, we're gonna have to write a little bit more logic to do this. So let's create a separate function called normalize page hash. As the first step, we're gonna read current page hash and store it within hash constant. Then, based on keys of nowItems object that correspond to every page name, we're gonna write condition in here and check if the current hash match any existing page, then it's considered valid hash, so we're going to return hash value. Otherwise, we're gonna have to update page hash. And we'll assign the name of the first page by assigning constant page timeline. And eventually, let's return the name of timeline page. Alright, so whenever valid page hash is specified, the current menu item in navigation bar will be highlighted based on that hash. And if we'll try to specify an invalid hash and refresh the page, then we notice that the first page will automatically get highlighted. And the page hash was also updated on the name of timeline page. And to implement such hash normalization, we have created a separate function inside of the now component called normalize page hash, and then used the return value of this function as the value for the reactive variable current page, so that based on this variable's value, Vue could properly highlight corresponding now item in the navigation bar. It is time to actually start working on page components. We already have navigation and can switch between menu items. So now it's time to show a particular page component whenever we select different menu items. All components that are going to represent our pages we're gonna store in Pages folder. Let's create new folder Pages and our first page component with the name the timeline. There can be only one the timeline component on the page, and that is why I have used prefix the in the component name. For now, we're gonna just place in here only one h1 element with text timeline, just to test if our page component will be properly shown. And let's go ahead and also create remaining page components. Second page will be the activities. It's going to have the same markup. We will just change the text in here. And the last page component we will create will be called the progress. Also change text in here, and now let's go back to the main app component. And now we're going to use those 3 page components within main tag in here. Let's add those components: the timeline, the activities, and the progress. And as with other components, in order to use these components here, we should firstly import them. So let's add import statements for every component. We're gonna import those components from Pages folder. And as you can see in Vue DevTools, we got those 3 components under app component, and their content is shown on the page on the left. And now we're going to connect those pages to menu items, so that when clicking a particular menu item, we're gonna display only one page component. And for that, we're gonna leverage one more Vue directive called vueshow. It works almost the same as conditional directive vueif, but instead of completely removing the element on which that vueif directive is used, vueshow is just going to hide element on which it is used by modifying element's CSS property display and setting its value to none. Whenever expression we're going to specify in this vueshow directive turns false, but the element will still be present in the DOM structure. It will be just hidden. And now let's specify condition which is gonna determine when to show timeline page. And we will have to show this page whenever a reactive variable current page equals to constant page timeline. In other words, when current page will be timeline. And just like that, we're gonna use this vueshow directive on other page components. Let's copy it and paste on every page component and use appropriate constants. Second page name is stored in page activities constant, and the third page name is stored in page progress constant. And here we got one problem. The thing is that this current page variable is defined within the now component. So in this app component, we don't have access to current page variable and cannot reference it in the template. And to fix it, we're gonna move the definition of this current page variable from the now component to app component. Firstly, we will move import, which imports all page names, to app component. And then we're gonna extract all code which defines current page reactive variable, as well as normalize page hash function, and move it to app component. And this way we're gonna be able to control current page from within root component. Let's not forget and also move import of ref function in this app component. We will also need to modify path which imports constants a little bit. And now by looking at developer console, we see that we got one JS error. And this error is related to undefined variable now items. This happened within app component. And the reason for that is because we use undefined variable now items within this normalize page hash function. So we'll have to change this part of code a little bit. This time we're gonna manually create an array which contains all page names. Let's copy over all constants in this array. And since we're still gonna need those constants inside of the now component, let's copy this import and add it inside of the now component. Because as you can see, those constants are still being referenced inside of this now items object. Alright, before checking it in the browser, let's modify import path for constants and take a look at Vue DevTools. Here we select root component app, and on the right side we see current page reactive variable, which currently holds page name timeline. And the thing is that this variable is also needed inside of the now component. And somehow we'll have to pass this variable inside of the now component. And in Vue, we do this by so-called props. Props are custom attributes that can be specified on the component. So for example, if I'll have to pass current page property in the now component, I'm gonna have to specify custom attribute with the name current page. Note that I use kebab case notation to specify attribute names. This is a naming convention of specifying attribute names within HTML. And now I'm gonna have to specify the value which I'm going to pass as value for current page property. Let's use the current page variable because this variable stores current page name. This is a reactive variable which we earlier moved from the now component in this app component. But that's not all, we'll also have to explicitly specify which properties components should accept. And we do this by using defineProps macro inside of that component which is going to accept props. In our case, this component is the now. In this component I'm going to use macro defineProps. Also notice that we don't need to explicitly import those macros. And to this macro we'll need to pass array which contains of property names that we will pass from outside in this component. In our case, we only have to specify one property with the name current page. And now as you can see, by selecting the now component in Vue DevTools, on the right side we see a new section called props with the list of all the properties which are being passed to this the now component from the app component. And by switching between now items, we can see that the value of the current page property also changes. But the way how it is implemented right now is not a good practice. Because if we take a look inside of the now component, in the template we see this assignment inside of clickListener, which directly modifies value of the current page property. And changing properties passed from parent components inside of child components is not good, so we're going to have to find another way of how we can modify value of this current page variable. And since this current page variable is defined inside of app component, it should also be modified in app component, but not in the now component. So we need to find a way to notify app component from the now component whenever user clicks on any menu item. In other words, we're gonna have to establish communication between child component and parent component. And in Vue, this is done by using custom events. Child component will fire a particular event, and parent component can listen for that event and do all the work it needs to do whenever a particular event is fired. And to declare events which can be fired from a particular component, we use another macro called defineEmits. This macro accepts array of event names, and we can call those custom events anything we like. So the fact of user clicking on menu item will be called navigate in our case. And now to fire this event from within this component, we should use an object, which we can get from this defineEmits call. And the object we will receive will be so-called eventEmitter. And now we can use this object in template whenever we need to fire a particular event. So instead of modifying property current page directly in this clickListener, we're gonna use our new eventEmitter, which we can call directly. First argument will be event name that we wish to fire, and as a second argument we can optionally pass data, which will be event payload and will be sent along with this event. In our case, we're gonna send this event to the app component and also include page name that we'll need to switch to, and the access to the page that the user has clicked on. From here we can get by using page variable. And finally, all we have to do after firing this event is to listen for this event from the parent component. We do this by using VueOnDirective on that component which is fired that event. In our case, the component which fired event is the now. Right here, let's specify VueOnDirective, and as an argument to this directive, we pass custom event name called navigate. Let's also use shorthand form of this VueOnDirective by using add symbol. And inside of this directive, we're gonna have to specify instructions that should be executed whenever this event is fired. And since we'll need to modify the value of the reactive current page variable, we need to somehow get access to the event data passed along with this event, and this data will be page name. In the parent component, data passed along with a particular event can be obtained by using a special variable called $event. And just like that, we're gonna assign the value of the currently selected page to current page reactive variable. And since this current page variable is a reactive, it's gonna trigger reactive DOM updates where this current page variable is used. As you can see, it is used to show a particular page component. So based on updates, Vue is gonna reactively update this part of DOM, reevaluate conditions in VShow directives, and display appropriate page. Let's take a look in Vue DevTools. While the Now component is being selected on the right side, we can see that the new section has appeared, called Event Listeners. And here we can see which events can be fired from within the Now component. Basically those events that we have specified inside of define_emits macro. And let's see the whole flow again, starting from the up component. So initially current page variable stores value of the page progress, and this value is being passed to the Now component as props. And now if we start clicking on menu items, it's gonna trigger that event navigate, which parent component up listens to. This component will handle this event and assign the name of the newly selected page to the reactive current page variable. And since this reactive variable is being passed to the Now component, it is going to re-render the Now component and highlight appropriate menu item based on the new value of current page prop. And as we can see on the page, menu item that we have clicked on is receiving appropriate background color. Let's also make it possible so that when clicking on logo or progress label within the header, we could navigate between pages, just like by clicking on menu items. And to do this, we're also going to modify reactive variable current page, which stores the name of the currently selected page. But now the signal to modify this variable's value should also come from the header component, besides the Now component, and particularly from the logo component and the header progress component, because both those elements that we're going to listen for clicks on are contained within those components. So let's get started, and first component we're gonna work on will be the logo. Let's open up this component, let's create new script tag, and in here import constant page timeline. Because we're gonna reference this page name inside of href attribute, so whenever user clicks on the logo, the page hash should be updated. So we need to specify appropriate page name as a hash. In this href attribute, let's use string interpolation and bind value of page timeline constant to this href attribute by using VueBind directive, or its shorthand form, colon. And now we're gonna register click listener on this anchor element. And thanks to default attribute inheritance in Vue, if we register listener directly on the logo component, it will automatically be inherited by root element of the logo component, which in our case means by that anchor tag. So let's use directive to register listener for the click event. And just like in previous lesson, to fire events, we have to use a special function which we will receive by using define_emits macro. In this macro we specify event names which can be sent from this component in the form of array. And since by clicking on logo we should be redirected to the page timeline, let's call this event go to timeline. We don't need to send any data associated with this event to parent component. So to fire this event, it's enough to only specify event name in the emit function. And now let's register listener for this event. Inside of up component, to register listener we use @ symbol with event name that we wanna listen for. Also note differences in naming. Where we listed events by using define_emits macro, we used camel case notation, because there we were inside of JavaScript context. But here we are inside of HTML context. So attributes should be named by using kebab case notation. And all we have to do inside of this listener is to modify a value of the reactive current page variable and assign page name. And since in this case we have to open timeline page, we need to assign the name of the timeline page to the current page variable, which we can do by using constant page timeline. And now let's take a look in the browser what happens when we click on the logo. And just like that we see that the first menu item timeline was highlighted, and the page hash now contains the name of the first page. And sure enough, that variable, which stores current page name, also stores value timeline. And now we will do almost the same steps to make progress label clickable as well. First of all, let's copy import of page timeline constant from the logo component and paste it into the header progress component, because we're gonna have to reference another page name inside of href attribute. Let's also use VueBind directive to bind value of constant to this href attribute but in this case, we need page progress constant. Because by clicking on this link, we should be redirected to the progress page. And let's also modify constant name while importing. We'll be listening for this event from inside of the header component. Let's declare another event in this define emits macro with the name goToProgress. And then we register listener for click event on the header progress component. This event directive will be inherited by the root element of the header progress component, which represents that progress label link which we will click on. And when this click is received, we're gonna send another event goToProgress to parent component, so that parent component could update reactive variable current page. In the same way, we're gonna register listener for goToProgress event and assign appropriate page name to current page variable whenever this event is received. And after all that is done, let's try clicking on progress label and notice that the page hash was changed, which now has the name of the progress page, and the menu item that says progress was highlighted. And now, besides clicking on menu items, we can also navigate between pages by clicking on logo or progress label within header. And finally, we'll go back to the app component and notice that in this template, there are 3 places where we modify value of current page variable. And this logic can be consolidated within one function, which we're going to create right now. This function will be responsible for modifying the value of current page variable. Let's call it goTo. As the first parameter, we're gonna accept page, which we should open, and this value we're gonna assign to current page variable. But the thing is that current page variable is a reactive variable. It is a special variable created by Vue, which has property value, and the new page name should be assigned directly to this value property. So now we just need to call this function in template. Let's use it for handling events goToTimeline and goToProgress, passing appropriate page constants as parameters. And lastly, let's also use this goTo function for navigate event that we receive from the now component. In this case, page name that we need is stored within event variable. So we're going to pass this variable directly to goTo function. And to make sure that nothing was broken after doing all that refactoring, we're gonna click around a little bit and verify that our navigation functionality works as expected. In order to make our Vue components linear, we're going to extract business logic of our application from Vue components and move it to separate JavaScript modules. If we take a look at app.Vue component, we will see in here that there is a function defined called normalizePageHash, and this function is not directly related to the template of this Vue component. So we're going to extract this function. Let's cut it from here and create a separate file in the source folder. We'll name it functions.js and place that function right here. And also let's move right here all necessary imports that are required by this function. That is the import of these 3 page name constants. And finally, let's export this function from this module by using export keyword. And now in any component, whenever we will need this function, we can basically import it from this functions.js module. Let's do this in app.Vue component. Write import instruction for normalizePageHash function. And by doing this refactoring, we were able to make our app component a little bit leaner and easier to grasp. And next we're going to do almost the same thing with constant nowItems defined within the now component. This constant stores object which represents our menu items. So let's switch over to the now component. In here let's find a definition of nowItems object, cut it from here and move it to the other JavaScript module called constants.js. Right away let's export this object and rename constant name by using uppercase letters. And by the way, right now we don't need to import all those extra constants which represent page names, since they're all defined in the same module. But what we still have to import is icon components. Let's cut and paste import for icons inside of constants.js file. Then we're gonna go back to the now component and from here remove the import of page name constants. And what we need to import here instead is that nowItems object. Let's also use a proper reference for this object inside of Vue directive in the template. And by doing all those minor tweaks, we haven't really changed logic of our application, but we have improved the readability of our code and made some of our components a little bit smaller. In this lesson, we will finally get to work on our main page, timeline, that is represented by the component called the timeline. So let's go ahead and create initial structure within that component. Let's open up file the timeline, and we will create the following markup div, within which will be UL element with only one list item for now and one anchor tag inside. And this anchor tag will be used to show a particular hour in a day. And since there are 24 hours in a day, we're going to render this li element 24 times. So let's use Vue directive. And besides iterating over arrays and object properties, Vue directive also allows us specify the exact number of iteration this loop should go through. And we'll say that we'd like to iterate over 24 times by specifying number. And in the browser, we're supposed to see that this li element was rendered exactly 24 times. And now let's hardcode basic array in here, which will contain 6 elements. And we will use loop variable I to show particular hour. And now we see that li element was rendered exactly 6 times. So now it's time to apply some styles to this li element. Let's go back to the editor and start applying classes. First of all, we're gonna assign CSS property position with value relative, make this element flexible container with the main axis vertical. Let's also specify spacing between all child elements, for example 2 units. To every li element we're gonna add top border with the gray color. And finally, we're also going to add paddings. Vertical paddings will be 10 units, horizontal paddings will be 4 units. Let's check it out in the browser, what we've got so far. And this is how our list items currently look like. Now we're going to assign classes for anchor tag. Let's round corners for this element, make background color gray. We're also going to specify horizontal paddings 2 units, use monospaced font with a large text. And the color of this text we're also going to make gray. And here it is. Now we're going to move this label so it is positioned in the center. It is actually very easy to do with Tailwind CSS classes. First of all, we're gonna have to make this A element absolutely positioned by using absolute class. Going to shift it up by 4 units and move it to the right by the half of the width of the parent container. And we're almost there. And now it's just a matter of moving this element a little bit to the left. And the distance that we should move it to the left should correspond to the half of the width of this element. And this can be achieved by one of the Tailwind CSS transform classes. And specifically the class that we need is called translateX 1/2. And since we are translating to the left, we also need to specify minus in front of this class. After that, we'll format the code in this file a little bit and look in the browser. And here we go, we have positioned this label exactly where it needs to be. We'll just have to make one more tweak so that the first label will be fully visible. Back to the editor, and for the main wrapper, which is this div element, we're gonna assign top margin by using class mt7. And so that we don't forget, let's also use key attribute next to the Vue directive. And as unique value, we can use loop variable I. And here's our final result so far. In the next lesson, we're gonna continue working on this page. In order to display all 24 hours of the day on this page, we're going to create a separate function. Let's go back to the editor. We will start in the timeline component. This is where we have a Vue directive which prints all those hours in a list. And now we're going to create a separate script tag in this component and create one constant, which is going to hold all hours in the array. Initially, this array will be empty, and down here, let's create for loop, which is going to iterate over all 24 hours of the day. And on every loop iteration, it's gonna add one more object into this timeline items array, which will consist from only one property, hour. And after this loop runs, we will get 24 objects in timeline items array, which we can use in this v4 directive. Right away in here, we're going to destructure every element of this array, which currently has only one property, hour. We will also use this variable as a value for key attribute. And at the bottom, let's also print out this value on the screen and check out in the browser. And what we are supposed to get right now is that all 24 list items will be printed on the page, based on that local timeline items array inside of the timeline component, which we can see on the right side. And also let's make sure that all 24 list items have been printed on the page. Let's scroll down the page to the bottom. As we can see, all hours are displayed. And now, since that logic which generates all these objects that represent hours can be considered as one logical unit, we're gonna create a separate function for it. And we'll call this function generate timeline items. Let's copy constant declaration inside of this function, and right after loop runs, we're basically going to return generated timeline items array. And whenever we're gonna need to generate timeline items, we basically call this function like this. And in terms of logic, nothing has been really changed. We still can see 24 list items on our page. Let's also improve readability of this function a little bit. And the simplest thing we can do in this regard is to extract this hard-coded value 24 into a separate constant. Let's name the constant hours in a day. And right before this function is defined, we're going to define this constant with value 24. That will represent amount of hours in a day. And after that, our function has become more readable. Currently in our project, we have a dedicated place where we can store all these generic functions. The file is called functions.js. Let's move this function inside of that file. Since this function is a pure JavaScript function which has nothing to do with Vue and does not use any of its specific features, we'll put this function at the end of functions.js file and export it from here. And since this function also references our new constant hours in day, we're going to place this constant inside of constants.js module. So let's grab this constant from the timeline component and move it to constants.js. As with other constants, we're gonna export this constant from here, and inside of functions.js, let's add an import for this constant. There are already quite a few constants that are imported in this file, so let's format this import a little bit by placing every constant on its own line. And finally, it's time to import generate timeline items function from the component where it will be used. That is inside of the timeline component. Right here, we're adding import statement for generate timeline items function, which we import from functions.js. And in this component, we use this function to generate timeline items and store it inside of timeline items constant. And we're referencing this constant right from the template inside of v4 directive. And now we got exact same result as before. All 24 items have been printed on the page. But now the underlying timeline items array that is used inside of v4 directive to print all those list items is generated dynamically by using the function which we imported from another module. And this way we separate our business logic from the components logic in order to make components leaner and more readable. In this lesson, we're going to move individual list item into its own component. So firstly, let's determine where markup for this element currently lies. And this whole list that represents individual hours is currently located within the timeline component. So let's open up this component in the editor. Here we're going to extract markup responsible for rendering list into component with the name timeline item. Let's go ahead and create a file for this component inside of the components folder with the name timeline item. Also, it is important to note that it's preferably to call Vue components by using 2 or more words to avoid any potential naming conflicts with new HTML text that may be added in the future. And also note that I haven't used prefix the in this component's name, because we're going to have more than one such component on one page. So in here we're gonna paste markup for individual list items, And inside of the timeline component, we're going to add import for this timeline item component. We're going to import it from components folder. And if before we were using v4 directive directly on the li element, now we need to move this directive along with key attribute and place it on our component timeline item, since now every hour will be represented by this component. And hence this component's markup should be rendered several times. Let's see what other variables are used inside of timeline item template. As we can see, currently there is only one variable called hour, and this variable should be passed inside of this component as a prop. So back to the parent component, right here let's add new attribute hour, which will be our new prop for the timeline item component. And on every loop iteration we're going to pass inside of timeline item component value of every hour. But since in the future this timeline item component is gonna require more data than just an hour, we're gonna pass the whole timeline item object. So let's change loop variable on timeline item and use this variable to pass it as timeline item property inside of timeline item component. And as always, to accept this new prop, we're gonna need to create script tag and use define props macro inside of the component which accepts this prop. In the form of array, we're gonna specify property names that should be accepted. In our case, it's only timeline item prop, and refer to our property on this object. This way we can print proper hour within every timeline item component. And also during Vue component imports, it is required to also specify file extension. Let's not forget and add this extension for this import. And inside of template, within key attribute, we should reference current hour by using timeline item object. So let's change it in here. And in Vue Developer Tools, right now we can see that the timeline component has a bunch of timeline item components. And each such component represents individual list item, which accepts prop with a name timeline item and renders proper hour value in the list on the page. And now let's go ahead and do a little refactoring inside of timeline item component. And first thing that we will do is extract all this long list of classes on this anchor tag and store it within variable with the name our_link_classes. Let's create this variable above and bind this variable to class attribute by using vbind directive. As we can see, vbind directive lets us also specify classes for a particular element in the form of array. And what we're gonna do next is we're going to highlight current hour in this list. For example, if my current time is 2 AM, then I should see this label highlighted with different color. So let's implement this behavior right now. We're gonna use ternary operator here and check the following expression. If current hour that has been passed as a property within this component equals to the current hour, which we can get from the date object by using getHours method, then this timeline item component represents current hour, and we will apply additional classes to the anchor tag to highlight our label with a different color. But before, to be able to reference props within script tag of Vue component, we firstly need to store props object in a variable or constant, and then reference all props inside of this component by using this object, like so. So now if this condition is true, we're going to make background color of our label purple, make font bolder, and the text color will be white. Otherwise, we're gonna keep background color as gray, and text color will be gray as well, with a little darker tint. And now let's remove these two classes from the initial list of classes up here. So after this ternary expression runs, those extra classes will be merged with the initial list of classes. And our constant, our link classes with all these classes will be bound to the class property of the anchor tag. And in the browser we will see that one of the hours will have a different background color. Currently my time is 9 AM, and therefore I see appropriate list item highlighted. Let's keep going in the next lesson. In this lesson we're going to add select box element to every timeline item component, so that users will be able to select particular activity for every hour But before, we're going to move timeline items array that is defined within the timeline component to the up root component, so that the timeline component will be only responsible for displaying this array on the page, but all data manipulations and all modifications of this array will be handled in a root component. And from the root component, data will flow into particular child components. And this way we're going to have one source of truth, which will be located inside of the root component. So let's open up the timeline component inside of the editor. We're going to cut this line which generates timeline items and place it within up component. Along with this, we should also move the import of the generate timeline items function into this component. In here we'll already import one function, so let's add another function name in this import, generate timeline items. And now, since this timeline items array is generated within app component, we're gonna use another prop called timeline items. And in here we will pass that array of timeline items. As always, we have to explicitly accept those props which components will receive. And we do this by using macro define props and specifying names of accepted props in the form of array. So after this change, we will not notice any differences, but internally timeline items array is generated at the top level in app component, and then it is passed down to the timeline component, so that the timeline component is still able to render all those list items. And then inside of the timeline component, every individual list item is getting passed as a prop into timeline item components. And individual timeline item components are responsible to render individual timeline items from the timeline items array. And now that we have done that, time to go to the timeline item component and add markup for the select element. Let's add here div, within which we add select element with only one option element. We're gonna make first option selected by default, also make it disabled, and the value will be an empty string. And if none of the activities will be selected by default, we will show default placeholder rest. And now let's add a few more activities. To be able to test this select element, we're gonna use coding, reading, and training. And as we can see, within every timeline item there is one select element. Let's continue and start applying styles to this select element. We're gonna make this select element occupy the whole width of the parent container by using class wfull. And then if the text inside will exceed available space, we're going to truncate it by using class truncate. And then let's round corners of the select element, make background color gray, vertical padding will be 1 unit, horizontal padding 2 units. And we will increase text size by making it 2XL. And here's what our select element looks like right now. Now it's time to add a little button to the left of this element. This button will be responsible for resetting value of this select element. Let's go ahead and create button tag right above the select element. And within this button, we're gonna use appropriate icon with the name xMarkIcon. And at the same time, let's specify the height for this icon. For this, we will use Tailwind CSS class h8. And in order to use this custom icon component, we firstly have to import it. Let's copy import of icons from another file, paste it within timeline item component, and use import of the icon that we need with the name xMarkIcon. Let's make sure that our icon has appeared on the page and continue. We're gonna style this button a little bit, round the corners, make background color gray, padding will be 3 units. And now we're gonna use Tailwind CSS class, which is gonna be applied only under certain conditions, when this button will be enabled, as well as when the cursor be on top of this button. Under these circumstances, we're gonna make background color gray with a little darker tint. In other words, we will darken this button a little bit. Then, when this button will be disabled, we will use class cursor not allowed, which is basically going to change cursor shape. And also let's add one more class when the button will be disabled. And this class will add transparency to this button. So once the button is disabled, it will also visually look like it is disabled. So now we have to position both these elements on one line. Let's add a few classes to the wrapper div. We'll make this div flexible container, and the distance between child elements will be 2 units. And here's what we got at this moment. Styles more or less done. And now let's go back to the timeline item component and render options in a little bit different way. Since we use Vue, we don't need to repeat markup of option elements. Instead, what we'll do is use Vue directive, which will help us render markup of specified elements several times. We're gonna go over array called options, which will hold all our options for this select element. On every loop iteration, we will receive value and label variables, and then use this value variable, which will basically store value of every select option. We'll use as a value for attributes key an attribute value on this option element. And to bind value of this variable to those attributes, we use vbind directive or its shorthand form column. And eventually let's interpolate value of the label variable and use it as a text for this option element. And now it's time to declare this options array, which is going to store objects. We'll create this array in here, and every object of this array will represent individual option elements for select box. Every object in here will have 2 properties called value and label, and let's fill in those properties with dummy values. And if we check it out on the page, as we can see, option labels are displayed wrongly, because instead of the label they render value property. So let's go back to the editor and understand why that happened. The reason is that I've used the wrong braces within Vue directive, since on every loop iteration we receive one object from options array, and in order to destructure this object in here, instead of the parentheses we have to use curly braces. And after we change this, if we take a look on the page, we'll see that all option labels are properly shown, and all those individual select elements are rendered based on the options property that is declared inside of timeline item component. We'll continue working on this select element in the next lesson. Let's keep working on our select element that we have created in the previous lesson. And now we're gonna move markup, which represents select element, into its own component. And this component will also contain another component, which will be responsible for showing that button on the left. First of all, let's determine where this markup currently resides, in which component, and the component that we need is called timeline item. We're gonna go inside of that component, timeline item, and from here, within the template, we're gonna cut our markup, which represents select element, and call a new component BaseSelect. And usage of the base prefix in the name is one of the conventions, which is widely used to name so-called base components. And base components are those that will be widely used in the application. They usually represent base UI elements, such as buttons, dropdowns, form fields, etc. So for our needs, we're gonna make select elements base component as well. And this is why I have followed this naming convention in here. So let's create a new file with the name BaseSelect, paste markup of the select element in here, and inside of timeline item component, we will add import for this BaseSelect component. So now that xmark icon import is no longer used in this component, let's move it inside of BaseSelect component. We'll create new script tag and place import in here. And if we take a look at the template of this component, we will see that here we use variable options, which is currently not available in this component, because it is defined in the parent component timeline item. It is this options array. So that means we're gonna have to pass this data inside of the child component BaseSelect. And we do this by using props. Let's define one prop called options on the BaseSelect component and pass options array in here. Besides this prop, we will also use another prop that will let us specify text for the select box default option. And we'll call this prop placeholder and interpolate it in here. Go back to timeline item component and let's pass another prop placeholder with the text rest. And so as far as we know, we have to explicitly define those props that are going to be accepted. We do this by using macro-defined props. Right here we accept two properties with names options and placeholder. And if we take a look at Vue DevTools, by choosing BaseSelect component, on the right side we can see props section now contains two properties, options and placeholder, as expected. But also we'll need to have a way to specify from outside which select elements option should be selected by default. And we're gonna do this with the help of another prop, which we will pass to BaseSelect component. Firstly, let's define constant selected activity ID within TimelineItem component. This constant will hold the ID of the currently selected activity from the options array. For example, let's emulate a situation where the second activity is selected. And now let's pass this ID of the selected activity into BaseSelect component as a separate property with the name selected. And use constant name in here. Let's add one more entry inside of define props macro for this new property, selected. And now let's go down to the template, and on the option element, we're gonna use another attribute called selected. This is a default HTML attribute of the option element. And if this attribute will be true, that means current option element should become selected. And here we're going to use JavaScript expression to define which option exactly should be selected. And all we need to do in here is compare values within value variable and within selected prop. And if those two values are equal, that means that the current option element should become selected. And since this is a JavaScript expression, we should bind this expression to this selected attribute. So let's use the bind directive in here by using colon. Let's apply formatting to the file and remove attributes name and ID from the select element. Those are currently not needed anyway. And as we can see in the browser, currently selected activity is reading, because value of the selected property equals to 2, which is ID of the activity with a name reading. Let's test it with another activity. For example, let's specify here an ID of third activity, which in our case is training. And sure enough, we're gonna see that all select elements currently show training activity as selected. So now that we have moved markup of the select element into its own component, time to do the same with button markup. We're gonna extract button markup from here and use BaseButton component instead. This will also be used as a base component to represent all buttons in the application. So that's the reason why we also use prefix base for this component name. Let's go up and write an import statement for this BaseButton component. And after this, we're gonna create separate file with the same name inside of the components folder. Create in here template tag and paste markup of the button. And then let's also add a script tag in here and move import of the xmark icon component within this script. And let's take a look at the tree of components within Vue DevTools. So inside of TimelineItem component, we have BaseSelect component, which contains BaseButton component. But since this button component should be reusable, currently it is not, because that icon which is used for this button is hard-coded directly within BaseButton component, which doesn't let us specify icon or button label from outside. And to make it possible, instead of directly hard-coding this icon in here, we're gonna use a special element slot. And at this place, whatever will be passed in between component tags is going to automatically be injected at the place of this slot element by Vue. And all we have to do right now is to specify desired markup within component tags. Let's add xmark icon markup in here, in between BaseButton component tags. And since this xmark icon component has been moved, we also have to move its import. And after this, from visual perspective, nothing has been really changed. But now we have an option to specify content for BaseButton component from outside, which makes our button component fully reusable. And now we can start seeing benefits of component architecture. We can create those atomic elements called components, and then combine those atomic elements to create bigger components. And this will be extremely helpful when our application will grow more and more. So now let's go back to BaseButton component, remove that empty script tag, and finish this lesson. let's see how we can specify configurations for props that we pass into components. For example, currently BaseSelect component receives 3 props with names options, placeholder, and selected. But the problem is that there are no restrictions on what kind of props we can pass, as well as what type of those props should be. And fortunately, Vue provides us with a way to specify types for individual props. And that's what we're gonna do next. So let's switch over to BaseSelect component. And on that place when we were using macro define props, this time we're gonna change this notation a little bit. And instead of the array, we're gonna use object to define each of our props. And keys of this object would be prop names and values corresponding prop types. So in our case, selected prop should be a number, options prop should be an array, and placeholder prop will be string. And now let's go ahead and try to pass wrong type to one of these props. For example, we're gonna pass string to prop selected. But before we have specified that this prop should accept number. And also let's change value for the placeholder prop. This time we will pass number instead of the accepted string. And after we have done that, in the console we're gonna see a few warnings, telling us that certain props that we have passed into components have wrong type. And this gives us extra confidence in what kind of props should be accepted by some components. So let's revert the changes we have done to these props and remove one prop, options. By default, all props accepted by components are optional, so Vue is not gonna raise any warnings. But if we would like to force this restriction, so that some props should be required, and we can do so by specifying another configuration for prop called required. We're gonna make options prop required by using a required key with the value true. And also to specify type for this prop, we're gonna use another key type with the value array. And indeed, in console we will see warnings related to options property, saying that this property is currently missing because we haven't passed it. Alright, let's go back to a timeline component and put options prop back. And this time, let's try to remove property placeholder. And besides specifying that certain props should be required, we can also specify default values for some props. And we do this by using another configuration key, default. And this way we can specify default value for placeholder property. Let's also specify type for this property, which is a string. And in the browser, if we open up select element, we will see the default label saying rest, even though we haven't passed this placeholder property directly. And in this case, default property value has been used instead. But for our use case, we're not going to keep this property as optional and make it required. Let's also return to timeline item component and put placeholder property back. And now let's go over all the components that currently accept props. And instead of specifying props in the form of array, we're gonna use object notation with some configurations. So the now component accepts one property called current page. We're gonna make this property required with the type string. Let's keep going. Open up timeline item component. Here we also accept one prop. This property will be also required with the type of object. Another component which accepts property is the timeline. In here we're gonna specify that timeline items property should be also required with the type of array. And let's check this out. From the app component, we're going to pass value of a different type into this timeline items property, for example, object instead of array. And the Vue should give us warning that type check for this property has failed. That is exactly what we see in a console. And this way, by specifying additional configuration for props, we can make our application code safer. In the previous lesson, we were looking at how to apply configurations for props. And in particular, we have looked at how to assign certain types for props. And now we're going to review one more important configuration option, with which we can apply custom validation rules for individual properties. Let's start with this example. BaseSelect component receives array of options in the options property, and every object in this array should have a certain shape. It should consist of label and value properties. But currently we don't enforce this restriction. So there is nothing stopping us from sending objects which may not contain one of these properties, label or value. And in order to ensure that the value that will be passed under options prop, we will add one more configuration option into this options object, which is called validator. This option receives function, which in turn receives value of the prop, which we are currently validating. Let's call this parameter options. And here we're gonna check that all objects that are being passed into this options array have a certain shape. We're going to iterate over every object by using every method. This method accepts callback, and the first parameter into this callback will be an object from the options array. And we can destructure this object right here by extracting properties value and label. And in order for this object to be valid, it should have two properties, value of type number and label of type string. We're gonna describe this logic right here and check types. Type of value should be a number and type of label should be a string. And now let's go back to timeline item component and try to change shape of these objects. We're gonna remove value property from the first object, and instead of using string for the label property in the second object, we're gonna use number. And now our custom validation should display some warnings in a console. And indeed, we can see those warnings. So our validation works perfectly. Now let's revert changes in this object and switch to the now component. This component accepts one property, current page. Here we can also try to apply custom validation. Let's add key validator, and in here we should somehow validate that the value passed to current page property should match one of the existing page names. And all valid page names we can extract from nowItems object. As we can see, this object consists of keys that correspond to every page name, and all those page names are defined as a separate constants right here. So back to our validator, and right here we can easily extract keys from nowItems object. This way we're gonna get array of valid page names, and then call method includes on this array if current value that was passed into current page prop matches one of the valid page name. Let's check it out by sending invalid page name into this property from the app component. And just like that, we can see that the warning has appeared saying that the validation failed for property with the name current page. So let's discard this change and go to the next component, timeline item. In the same way, we're gonna add validator property into timeline item configuration object. And here we're gonna write validation logic that the timeline item object has correct shape. In order for this object to be valid, it should have a property hour, which should be a number, and this hour property should have value which is included in a certain range. Since this should be a valid hour, it should be greater or equal to 0. And at the same time, it should be less than 24 hours. And we already have a constant which stores this value. It's called hours in day. So all we have to do in here is to import this hours in a day constant from constants file. And just to reduce the amount of code inside of validator, we can destructure our property in the parameter list and reference this property directly. And now let's try to make this validation fail. First of all, we have to determine where that array of timeline items is generated. It happens on this line within app component by using function generate timeline items. And if we take a look at this function, which is located inside of functions.js file, we will see in here for a loop, which adds objects to a timeline items array. And all these objects contain our property. And if we manually try to assign invalid hour to this property, for example 25, and check the result in the browser, we can see that our validation works, and we see a warning related to invalid value being passed to timeline item prop. And finally, let's define one more validator for property timeline items within the timeline component. Let's create a validator which is going to go over all elements inside of timeline items array and check that every object within this array corresponds to a certain shape. And luckily we already wrote validation which can be reused in here. and this validation is located within timeline item component, which checks individual timeline item objects. And since we should do pretty much the same validation in here, we just have to run this validation for every object inside of timeline items array. So let's paste this chunk of code in here, then convert this to an arrow function, destructure our object property within parameters, and that's all we need to make sure that the passed array inside of timeline items prop will have a valid form, and every object within this array will have a valid value for the hour property. And now let's just copy over the import of a constant hours in a day and paste it inside of the timeline component. And that is it for this lesson. We have seen how to apply custom validation rules for props. At the moment we store some logic related to validation directly in Vue components. And since this logic does not use any specific Vue features, it can be easily extracted into its own module, which will be completely decoupled from Vue. And this way we're gonna also clean up our Vue components a little bit more. So let's try to move validation logic into a separate file, which we'll call Validators.js. We will create this file inside of source folder, and let's just go ahead and extract logic related to validation. We're going to create and export separate validation functions on here. For example, the first validator we'll call isPageValid, since it is going to validate page name. This logic references constant nowItems, so we have to import this constant from constants module. Let's write import in here for nowItems constant. This validator function should be passed page name, which we will validate. So let's specify one param in here with the name page. And then we're going to pass this param further into includes method. Let's keep going and extract more logic related to validation. Switch over to timeline item component. In here, we're gonna copy this part of code, actually cut it from here, and move it inside of Validators.js module. This logic validates if timeline item object has valid shape. So we're gonna call this validator isTimelineItemValid and paste that validation logic in here. As a param, it's going to accept timeline item object. So we can easily extract our property which we reference inside of this validator. And also, as we can see, we're using constant called hours in a day in this validator. So let's go up and import this constant from constants module. And now we're going to use this validator isTimelineItemValid inside of timeline item component. And first thing that we should do is to import this function. Let's write an import statement in here and then reference this isTimelineItemValid function as the key for validator option inside of this prop configuration object. And this way, in order to validate timeline item prop, Vue is going to call our function isTimelineItemValid. Let's continue and switch to the timeline component. Here we can see that we also use some validation logic. Here we run validation for every object inside of timeline items prop. But if we look more closely at this line, we can see that this is basically the same logic that we wrote right here inside of isTimelineItemValid validator. So to avoid code duplication, we're gonna import this function inside of component the timeline. And then we'll be able to easily reuse this validation function inside of this every method, so that this every method could call our custom validation function for every timeline item object which we receive inside of timeline items prop. And now the constant which gets imported in here is no longer needed. Let's remove this import. And finally, let's go back to the now component. Earlier, right here, we removed validation logic, and based on this logic, created custom validation function with the name isPageValid. So let's go ahead and import this function inside of the now component and reuse this validator for current page prop. And this way we decoupled validation logic from Vue components and made our Vue components look cleaner. And if we'll go ahead and try to click around our application, we will see that our application still works as expected. We will continue development in the next lesson. Besides validating props, we can also validate events that we declare by using define_emits macro. So firstly, let's discuss what it means to validate event. In this case, event validation means to check if the data that is sent along with this event to the parent component is actually the data that we expect. meaning that it has a correct data type as well as correct shape. So to specify a validator for an event, we also have to use object notation in here. The keys in this object will correspond to event names, and values of these keys will point to validator functions. Earlier we already defined one validation function called isPageValid, and this validator checks if page name is valid. If we take a look at the implementation of this function isPageValid inside of validators.js file, and put here arbitrary console log statement, for example, to print out the value of the page variable. And now if inside of the now component we're going to emit event with name navigate, and as a payload specify invalid page name instead of this page variable right here, then that validator function isPageValid should kick in, print out that page name and validate it. And it is going to check if the passed page name is valid by using navItems object, which as we see stores valid page names as keys. So if in the browser we're going to fire that navigate event by navigating to the different page, instantly we're going to see in the console a couple of warnings. First warning says that event with the name navigate didn't pass validation, and another warning is related to failed probe validation with the name current page. Because if we pass invalid page name with the event navigate, then that invalid page name will be passed further to the component thenow inside of current page prop, and which is why we see two warnings in console. So let's go back to the editor and revert changes that we did to the now component, and also remove that console log statement inside of isPageValid function, because we already made sure that our event validation for event navigate works as expected. And now we're going to apply the same validation but in a couple of other components, the logo and the header progress. Because currently in our application, if we click on either of those components, we should be redirected to the corresponding page. So those components also emit event with the name navigate, and we can apply validation for that event in the same way. Let's go ahead and do that. Firstly, let's open up component the header. For now we're listening for a click event on the logo component, and when this event happens we're firing another event with the name goToTimeline. And almost the same thing happens when we click on the header progress component. But in this case we fire a different event, goToProgress. But in fact both of these events should be handled in a similar way in the app component. So instead of using two different events, we can reuse one event, just like we did in the now component. Let's copy over this define_emits macro from here, paste it to the header component. Previous usage of the define_emits macro can be removed. And now let's copy over import of the validation function isPageValid and also move it to the header component. And now instead of firing two different events whenever we click on the logo or on progress label, we can use the same event navigate just like we did inside of the now component. In the first case, as a page name, we should specify page name of timeline page, which is stored within page timeline constant. And in the second case, we're gonna pass a different constant, which stores name of the progress page, constant page progress. And now both of these constants should be imported in this component. Let's write down import for those constants. And since we changed event name which is fired from within the header component, we should also accept this event from the app component. That means we have to go back to the app component. Here we remove old event listeners for goToTimeline and goToProgress events, since both of those events do not exist anymore. And instead of this, we're gonna listen to only one event with the name navigate. Let's take a listener registration from the now component, place it on top of the header component right here, and this listener, which is goTo function, will take care about everything for us. It is going to modify value of the reactive current page variable, which will trigger re-rendering of this part of template where that current page variable is used. And this way we're gonna be redirected to the desired page. And now let's take a closer look at one more thing. That logic that we have extracted into this isPageValid function also exists in another place, inside of normalizePageHash function. So this if condition right here pretty much runs the same logic. which we have extracted into isPageValid function. It is just written in here in a little bit different form. So to avoid code duplication, we can easily reuse isPageValid function. In this condition, let's replace everything in here and call function isPageValid, passing page name, which is stored inside of hash constant. But probably page name will be more appropriate name in this case, so let's rename that constant on page. And now we can also see that two constants after our current refactoring are no longer used in this file. Let's remove import of both, and instead copy over import of isPageValid function and move it to functions.js. Another thing that we're going to improve right now is related to so-called magic constants. For example, inside of the function isTimelineItemValid, we can see that here we currently hardcode number 0, but this number doesn't really mean anything. And by looking at this function, we cannot understand what this number 0 really represents. The same number is also used inside of generateTimelineItems function. So it will be good to give this number a name. And we're going to create constant and call it midnight hour, since that number represents first hour of the day. Later we're gonna define this constant inside of our constants.js module, but for now, let's import that constant first and place all these constants that we import on one line. And let's go ahead and do the same inside of Validators.js function. We'll replace number 0 with constant midnight hour. And above, let's add this constant name to the import statement. And finally, we're gonna have to declare this constant in constants module. Let's switch over to this module, export new constant with the name midnight hour and the value 0. And we're done. Finally, let's check that our application still works as expected. Let's click around a little bit and try to navigate between different pages. As we can see, we get desired behavior, so everything still works. In this lesson, we're going to keep extracting validation logic in a separate module. Let's start with BaseSelect component, go down to the validator function. Let's extract this piece of code. Here we validate options of select box element. So we can create a new function with the name of validate select options and create this function in our validators module. And this way we're cleaning up our components code even further. Inside of validators.js file, let's export new function with the name validate select options. Then we're gonna paste that validator markup we just got, and those options that we have to validate will receive as a param. Let's name it options. And now take a look at this part of code. What does it actually do? In fact, it also does validation, but validation of individual item in this options array. So this can be a good candidate to extract into separate function as well, just to follow separation of concern principle and make our functions do one specific thing. In here we're going to pass reference on the function we will create right now, isSelectOptionValid. It will be another validator, which would declare down here, where we paste that code which will validate individual select option elements. We will receive an object that we should validate as a param. Let's destructure this object right here and extract value and label properties. These properties are already used inside of body of this function, so all we have to do is to return the result of this whole expression. And now let's copy over import of one validation function, place this import inside of BaseSelect component, and import validate select options validator that we have just created. And now let's check if our validation of select options works as expected. We're gonna modify array which stores select options. It is this options array inside of TimelineItem component. Instead of using number for the value property, we're gonna use string. And then this options array will be passed as a property to BaseSelect component. And this BaseSelect component is supposed to validate our property options. And in the browser we can see that indeed we get some warnings in console. And the reason why we receive so many is because we have several select box elements on the page. And this warning is printed for every select box element, 24 times to be specific. So our new validation function works. Let's revert the changes we have done to options array in here. and extract one more validator from the timeline component. In here we validate timeline items prop. So this function can be extracted into validators module. And by the way, within this validator, we already use one validator function called isTimelineItemValid to validate individual objects from timeline items array. And now we're gonna create another validation function to validate array of such objects, which we will extract into validators file. Let's create this function right below the isPageValid function. Call it validate timeline items and export. We will receive an array that we have to validate as a param, timeline items, and then this timeline items array will be iterated over by using every method. And for every object inside of this array, it is going to call another validation function isTimelineItemValid. So this way, every object of timeline items array will be validated. And even though we use this isTimelineItemValid validator inside of another validator, and both these validator functions belong to the same module, we still have to export both these validators from this module, because they are both used directly inside of Vue components. So let's import correct validation function name inside of the timeline component. Here we should import validate timeline items. And finally, let's check if the validation logic, which is supposed to validate individual timeline item object from timeline items array, works properly. Firstly, let's find the place where array of timeline items objects is generated. It happens inside of this generate timeline items function, where we, on every loop iteration, add one object into timeline items array, and each such object for now contains only one property with the name hour. And if we try to assign invalid value for an hour, for example 25, then right away our validation will fail and Vue will let us know about it in the console, saying that custom validator check failed for prop timeline items. So we have verified that our new validators also work as expected. Let's revert this change we have made to our property, and let's finish this lesson. In this lesson, we're gonna make our select box element controllable by the parent component, meaning that we will keep track of the selected value inside of state variable of the parent component. And additionally, whenever a user will click on this reset button, the currently selected option of the select box should be reset. So let's get started and determine which component contains this BaseSelect component. As we can see in a tree of components, this component is contained within timeline item component. So let's open up this component inside of editor. And in here we already have a constant which is supposed to store currently selected option. And this constant is passed to BaseSelect component as selected prop. So now within the BaseSelect component, we should somehow notify parent component whenever selected option will be changed. And there is native DOM event called change, which we can assign a listener to directly on this select element. And once this event occurs, we're going to fire an event with the name select to the parent component. And along with this event, we should also pass the value of the currently selected option, which we can get by accessing event object via variable event, and the DOM element which has triggered this event is stored within target property in here. And then we can access value of this select element via value property. And since our BaseSelect component is gonna fire custom event with the name select, let's declare this event by using macro define emits. At the same time, we're going to assign validation function to validate payload of this event. As a payload, we're gonna be passing currently selected option value. And this option value should always be a number. So let's write down the check and make sure that the type of the passed value will be a number. As a next step, we're gonna have to listen for this custom event from parent component. Let's switch over to timeline item component, and on BaseSelect component, we're gonna use event directive and specify event name which we will listen for. Event name is select. And once this event is received, we're gonna update the value of the variable selected activity ID and assign newly selected option value, which we can get from event variable. And after this, in the browser, we're gonna see the following. When we select timeline item component in here, on the right side we can see that the initial value of the selected activity ID variable is 3. That means activity with an ID of 3 should be selected on the page in that select box. And then this value is going to be passed as a property inside of BaseSelect component in the property with the name selected. And once we'll try to change the value of the select box, we will notice inside of timeline item component that the selected activity ID variable's value has changed, and it has received ID of the first activity. And then this updated activity ID should be passed down to BaseSelect component within selected prop. But in fact, we don't see it in here. Selected property still contains initial value at 3. So this doesn't work currently because that selected activity ID variable is not a reactive variable, and Vue does not re-render select box component whenever its value changes. So we're gonna have to convert this variable into a reactive variable by using ref function. Let's also go up and write down import for this ref function from the Vue package. And this time, whenever we're gonna receive select event from BaseSelect component, we're gonna assign new value of the selected option to this reactive variable selected activity ID, which should cause re-rendering of certain parts of our template, particularly those parts that depend on this reactive variable, including this BaseSelect component, because it receives the value of this reactive variable as a property with the name selected. And within this BaseSelect component, that expression inside of selected attribute in here should be evaluated again based on the updated value of the selected property. A newly selected option should be shown on the page within the select box. So let's do it one more time. Let's update value of this select element. It causes value 2 to be assigned to selected activity ID variable. But this time, in addition to that, this updated value will be passed down to BaseSelect component. And as we can see in here, selected property got new value. But looks like right now this value is a string, but we need this to be a number. So to convert string to a number, we will just use plus sign in front of this expression when we are sending currently selected option value to the parent component with the event select. And now in the browser we'll check it out one more time. After modifying value of the select box element, we'll see that this time value of the selected activity ID variable as well as value of the selected property inside of a BaseSelect component is indeed number. And now last thing that we'll do in this lesson is to reset value of the select box element by clicking on the reset button. We're going to register click listener on the BaseButton component, and once we receive this click event, we're going to emit another event to the parent component with the name select. And as a payload, we're gonna pass null, since we'd like to reset currently selected option. And one more time, let's take a look in the browser. Initial value for the selected activity ID property is 1, but after we modify value in the select box, it was properly updated, and after we're gonna click on the reset button, it is supposed to get value of null, which is what's happening right now. But this still does not work as expected, yes, because if we take a look at the select element, we still can see here a selected activity. But instead what this select element should show as a selected value whenever a variable selected activity ID is null is default option with a text rest, which is not the case right now. So we're gonna fix it in the next lesson. In the previous lesson we have stopped at the point where we could control value of the select box element. But we also faced a different issue, which is when we try to reset the value by clicking on this button. In Vue DevTools we can see that the appropriate variable with the name selected activity ID was reset and assigned the null value. But this was not reflected in the UI and we still can see selected value in the select box. So let's try to figure out what is going on. Let's open up component BaseSelect, scroll down to the option element, and here let's focus on the selected attribute. And based on the value of the selected prop that we pass into this component, that also determines which option should be selected, we can try to bind an expression to this selected attribute. We're gonna check if selected property is equal to null. And in this case, this default option with a placeholder should be pre-selected in cases when no other option is selected. And let's test it out. Let's pick a different value in this select box, then click on the reset button, and this time The select value was reset and we see default label with text rest. And now let's see what happens if we will not set initial value to reactive variable selected activity ID. In this case, its value will be equal to undefined. Then this value gets passed to BaseSelect component in selected property. And eventually that expression inside of selected attribute of the BaseSelect component will be evaluated to false, because undefined is not equal to null. So in this case, this option will not be selected by default. And this is a problem because instead of it, the first activity is selected, which is not what we need. And to avoid such situations, we're gonna add one more check in here, which will compare selected variable with undefined. And now whether selected property is equal to null or undefined, the first option of the select box will always be preselected by default. And indeed, we see that the option with default label rest was selected. And actually this check seems quite big to keep it in the template. So in order to avoid such expressions and keep templates lean, we can always extract such chunks of logic into separate variables. So we're gonna create new variable with the name isNotSelected. And then let's scroll up to script tag. Here we're gonna create constant with the name isNotSelected. And for this variable, we're gonna use another Vue.js concept called computed properties. It is created like so. Firstly, we call function with the name computed, which will soon import from the Vue package. This function accepts closure where our custom logic for this property will reside. And this logic will produce value for our computed property. But most importantly, this closure will rerun every time whenever one of the reactive properties used inside of this closure will change. In this case, we're using one reactive property called selected, which by the way we need to fetch from props object. Anytime we refer to props within script tag of the component, we should refer to them via an object. Usually it is called props, and this object we should get from define props call. So firstly, let's go up and write an import for computed function from the Vue package. And then in here, where we call define props macro, we're gonna assign result of this call to props constant. And this props object is gonna contain all properties of this component. And back to our computed property is not selected. So the closure defined here within computed function will rerun anytime when selected property will change. And this way new value will be derived for our isNotSelected property. So we don't need to manually keep track of changes within selected property to keep value inside of isNotSelected variable up to date, because magic of computed properties will do it for us. Let's modify value of the select box element, then reset this value. After this select box element still shows default label rest, and this is intended behavior. So our computed property isNotSelected works as expected. And let's take a closer look at this line. It is actually can be considered a validation logic. So we can easily extract this part into a separate validator function. Let's call this function isUndefined or null. And the value that we're going to validate will pass as a param into this function. It is our selected prop. And now we'll go inside of validators.js. Somewhere in here, we're gonna declare an export new function with the name isUndefined or null. This function will accept one parameter. And let's replace mentions of props selected with this param name, value. And now let's go back to BaseSelect component. Let's place this computed property on one line and import this custom validator function above. We just need to add this function name to an import statement, which already imports another validation function, like so. And now let's take a look at another validation, which we apply to custom event with the name select. Every time we change value inside of select box, our component fires event with the name select. And along with this event, it will also send currently selected value as a payload. And this validation function tells us that this payload should be a number. But what will happen if we try to reset value of the select box? Because in that case, this payload will be null, so this validation will fail. Let's check it out. I'm gonna choose different value in this select box, then reset this value, and in console we see a warning. So event validation failed for an event with the name select. So that validation check that we have for this select event is not going to work anymore, because we also have to allow null values as a payload, since whenever we reset value of the select box, the payload of this select event will be equal to null. So we're going to create another validation function, which we'll call isNumber or null. And this function will allow all numbers as well as null values. So let's add a third entry to this import statement, function with the name isNumber or null, and then open up Validators file and declare this function. Let's put it right under the isUndefined or null function. Here we paste that check, and additionally we should add another check which will compare this variable with null. Also, let's not forget and specify one parameter in this function with the name value. And also notice that inside of this function, as well as inside of previous function, we have two exact expressions that compare value with null. So in order to not repeat ourselves, we can extract this expression into separate function, which we can call isNull, since all this function will do is to compare input value with null value. In the same way, we're gonna declare new function with the name isNull, paste that expression, and specify one param with the name value. And after this, within isUndefined or null function, we have another minor inconsistency. Here in the first part of this expression we use custom function to check value, and in the second part we use operator directly. So this function technically has two different levels of abstractions, and we will try to bring it to only one level of abstraction. To do so, we're gonna extract this logic into its own function with the name isUndefined, and also to align the logic inside of this function with the function name, we're gonna reorder these two checks. And down below, let's copy over function isNull, paste new function with the name isUndefined, and we're gonna compare this value with undefined. Let's continue bringing up our validation functions to have one level of abstraction. So we're gonna extract this part into another validator with the name isNumber. As always, let's declare a new function isNumber and paste that check. Moving on, and let's scroll up to isTimelineItemValid function. Right here, the first part of this expression can be replaced with the function call isNumber. Let's do so. And as for the second part of this expression, it is not clear right away what kind of validation is happening in here. So we can create another function with a meaningful name to make this part of an expression more readable. In fact, what we are doing in here is we're checking if value of a certain variable is contained within specified range. So let's spell it out. We're gonna create function with the name isBetween. Let's scroll down a little bit. Here we're gonna create that function, paste here that logic we just got. And besides accepting the value in this function, we also have to accept start and the end of interval, since we need to know where the interval begins and where it ends. For this, let's add two more params with the name start and end. And then let's use these params in this expression. Now let's go up to that place where we call this function and pass all necessary params. First of all, we pass an hour that we're gonna validate. Then we pass beginning of range and the end of range. And also we're gonna make our range inclusive, so let's use operator less or equal to in here. And since in the future, in order to determine whether timeline object will be valid or not, we're gonna rely on more than just a simple check, which checks only our property of this object. We can also extract this line into a function with a readable name. For example, isOurValid, which makes it clear what exactly we're validating in here. And by the way, this function can be a private function in this module, so while defining this function, we don't need to use export keyword. After that, let's scroll down to the last validation function. Here we use those expressions that were previously moved into separate function. So let's just replace these expressions with proper function calls. The second part of an expression will use isString function. And by the way, for this logic, we don't have a proper validator yet. So let's create this validation function right here, where we will simply check if the type of the passed value is a string. And for the second part of this expression, we have a validator. It is called as number. So let's use that validation function and move this isString function closer to isNumber function. Place it right here. And isSelect option valid function, we're going to move closer to isNumber or null function. And eventually, after doing all this refactoring, it's time to finally check everything in the browser. Firstly, we're gonna check if our select boxes have desired behavior. As we can see, they all work as expected. And now let's check navigation. Let's click around in our application and see if we are redirected to the appropriate pages. And everything seems to be working fine. Even though our validation.js module has grown a lot, but now we have a bunch of custom validation functions, which we can use as many times as we need to validate properties and events, which in turn will make our code much safer and help us prevent a variety of bugs in the future. Now let's create a new component that represents this item, which shows our label. To do so, firstly, we're gonna open up component timeline item, which stores markup for that element. Here we're going to find markup of that element, which is this anchor tag. Cut it from here and create a new component called TimelineHour. And then, as always, let's create a new file inside of components folder with the name TimelineHour. Here we're gonna add template tag and paste our components markup. And then let's also add a new empty script tag in here, because we're gonna have to move some variables from timeline item component inside of TimelineHour component. First of all, it is this constant, our link classes. Let's move this one inside of TimelineHour component. And also, since this component will need to accept one prop, which will be a value of an hour, we'll also copy and paste props definition from timeline item component, and then back to timeline item component, and in here we no longer use props constant, so we can remove it from here. And now we're gonna use our new component TimelineHour in this component's markup. So let's import TimelineHour component, and then scroll down to the template area, and to this TimelineHour component we'll need to pass one prop with the name hour. And the value for this prop we're gonna fetch from our property of timeline item object. And of course we'll need to rename the property where we defined it. Let's rename this timeline item on hour. Let's also use proper validation function for this property with the name isHourValid. And luckily we have already defined this function within Validators module. So far we haven't used this function anywhere outside of validators.js file, so it is private. But now we'll need to use it in one of our components, so let's export this function and move it up to group it with the rest of public validators. And now let's copy import statement for one of the validation function, paste it inside of TimelineHour component and rename function name. So we are importing isHourValid function and use it to validate our property in this component. And also this property hour, its type should be a number. Let's fix it in here. And then on that place, when we referenced our property by using timeline item object, it will no longer work because we don't have access to timeline item object. So we'll have to reference this our property directly on props object. And since our component scope has been narrowed, we no longer need to be that specific and use this our link classes variable name, since this component has only one element within its markup. And we can assume that these classes will be applied to that element. So let's just go with more straightforward name. Let's call it classes. And on that place inside of template, where we are outputting value of an hour, while converting it to the appropriate format. In order to not pollute our template with logic, we can represent this formatted value by computed property. Let's call it formatted hour. And then inside of script tag, we're gonna declare another constant with the name formatted hour. This constant will be a computed property, so we need to use a special Vue function called computed and pass closure in here. And based on the return value of this closure, we're gonna derive formatted value for the hour. And since we are inside of script tag, we need to reference our prop via props object, and eventually return this template string from this closure. And of course, we'll need to import this computed function from the Vue package. Let's scroll up and add appropriate import for this function. And after doing all those changes, let's make sure that nothing was broken. As we can see, all our labels are properly shown. But we're going to make output format more consistent, in a way that hour will always be represented by using 2 digits. So for example, if a particular hour, for example 8 AM, consists of only 1 digit, we're gonna normalize it and add leading 0, so it will show as 08. So let's go back to TimelineHour component and modify computed property a bit. First of all, we're gonna convert hour's value to string by using toString method, and then we will use native string method called podStart. As a first parameter, we will specify desired string length. We'll say that every hour should be represented by using 2 symbols. But if hour will consist of only 1 digit, we will add leading 0, which we can specify as a second argument into this function. And now in the browser we will see that all our labels are displayed by using 2 symbols, and some hours are shown with leading zeros. In fact, we don't even need to use computed property to format hour, because in this case our property is not really gonna change. So there is no need to keep track of changes within this hour prop. So let's refactor this line to use a simple constant instead of computed property. And finally, we don't need that import of computed function on top. Let's remove it from here. And on the page, everything still looks good. We're going to continue development in the next lesson. It is time to start working on the second page in our application called Activities, which is represented by the component with the name The Activities. So let's go inside of that component. Let's clear existing markup in here. What we're gonna do instead is we're gonna add div with UL element. This list will contain only one list item for now, which in turn will have 2 divs. And this list is going to represent our list of activities. Inside of the first div, we're gonna add button to remove activity. So let's copy markup of the button from BaseSelect component. We're gonna reuse our BaseButton component in here. Let's paste this markup inside of this div and rename icon component. In this case, we'll need component with the name trash icon. And also we don't need to register any listeners for now. Right below this button, we will show activity name inside of the span. And inside of the other div, we're gonna add BaseSelect component, which represents our select box. So by using this select box, people will be able to choose how much time they wish to spend on a particular activity. So now let's go up and import all necessary components. We'll create script tag, copy import from another file. First import statement will import BaseButton component, and the other one will import BaseSelect component. And just because we also use custom icon component inside of the activities component, we need to import trash icon. So let's do it right here. And because our current component, the activities, is located within pages folder, to import base components, firstly we should leave pages folder and then refer to components folder. Let's modify both of these imports. And let's see what this markup currently looks like in a browser. We got a button to delete activity, activity's name, as well as select box to select how much time we wish to spend on this activity. Let's keep going, and now we're gonna apply classes to li element. We're going to make this li element flexible container, where main axis will be vertical, distance between child elements will be 2 units, and paddings will be 4 units. And this way we got a little bit more spacing between all these elements. Let's also add spacing between delete button and activity name. To do so, we're gonna assign following classes to this div. Class flex, items center, to vertically align child elements within this container, and let's increase spacing between child elements, specify 2 units. And now that we have more spacing between delete button and activity name, Let's see what happens when our activity name will be too long. And in such cases, when activity name will not fit inside of the parent container, instead of showing activity name on multiple lines, we're gonna truncate the name and add ellipses at the end by using class truncate. And at the same time, we're also going to increase font size. And after this, in the browser, we can see ellipses at the end. And our activity name was truncated. So let's get back normal activity name and continue. Now we're going to specify a couple of properties for BaseSelect component. This component accepts property with the name placeholder, which is a placeholder text for the select box. And also we'll need to pass array of options for the select element, which we can do by passing another property with the name options. And in this case, our array of options will be stored within period select options constant. Before declaring this array, let's see in the browser if we can see default text for select element, which we do in here. Now let's go back to component and declare new constant period select options, which is gonna hold options array for the select element. And every object inside of this array will have two keys, value and label. Value key will store amount of minutes that we'd like to spend on a particular activity, and label key will store human readable value of the amount of minutes. And now to have something to test, we're gonna add a couple more objects inside of this array and modify values. Second object will store 30 minutes, and the third object will store 45 minutes. And if we'll take a look at our Vue DevTools, after selecting BaseSelect component, on the right side we can see that the props option stores that array of options with objects with key, label and value, and all these objects were rendered inside of a select element. We can see all these options right here. And now let's also use monospaced font for the select box label. We'll assign a class with the name fontMono to BaseSelect component. And now we can see that the select box label has more digital look, so to say. Alright, so now we're gonna repeat this markup of a li element several times, just to render all our activities in a list. For this, we're gonna iterate over activities array in here by using v-for directive. Then let's go back to the script tag and declare this array. Let's create new constant activities, which is going to hold the array of 3 activities: coding, reading, and training. And then we can use activity name as a unique value for key attribute. Let's also interpolate activity name inside of this span. So in the browser we will see that all our 3 activities were rendered in a list. And as a final improvement, we're also going to add a little border between list elements for better visual separation. It is pretty easy to do with Tailwind. We only need to add one class to parent container, which stores all our elements between which we'd like to add border. And since we're gonna split child elements vertically, we'll need to add class with the name divide-y. And here we go. Now we have a border between all list items. We're gonna continue working on this page in the next lesson. On this activities page that we have created in the previous lesson, we have a perfect candidate for creating separate component, and that is this markup of individual list item, which represents activity. So let's go inside of the activities component, cut the whole markup of this list item, and the component which is going to represent individual list items will be called activity item. Please note that I haven't used prefix the in the component name, since this component will be used on the page more than once. And as we have already done several times before, we're gonna create new component within components folder with the name activity item and paste our list item markup in here. But now we need to move this v-for directive from this component and place it directly on our new component tag, activity item. Since now we're going to render activity item component multiple times, depending on how many elements will be inside of activities array. But this activities array is declared in the current component the activities, so activity item component doesn't know which activity exactly it should render. And to tell activity item component which activity it should render, we're gonna pass activity as a property with the same name, activity. And since activity item component also has to render select box with a list of options specified inside of period select options, we also have to move this constant inside of activity item component. So let's create new script tag within activity item component and paste that list. Along with this, we also have to move all necessary imports from the activities component. Let's cut these 3 imports from here and move it inside of activity item component. And just because activity item component is stored within components folder, we no longer have to mention this folder when importing base components. And what we're gonna have to do instead is to go back to the activities component and import our new activity item component from the components folder. And then time to declare one property which activity item component accepts. With the name activity, we're gonna use macro define props and use object notation to declare our props. Let's add one property with the name activity, which will be required, and the type of this property will be string. And in order to store currently selected value of the BaseSelect component, we need to declare separate variable. Let's do it right here. This will be a reactive variable, so we need to use special Vue function called ref. An initial value for this variable will be null. And don't forget that ref function should be imported from Vue package. And now if we inside of Vue DevTools will select activity item component, on the right side we can see that our new reactive variable seconds to complete has appeared. And now we need to pass value of this variable down to BaseSelect component as a property with the name selected, just to be able to control value of the select box from parent component, which in our case is activity item component. Let's also use one of the values of the select box as initial value for seconds to complete variable. For example, we can specify 15. And after we pass down this variable seconds to complete as a property selected inside of BaseSelect component, we should see that all select elements will automatically show that value. And indeed, all select boxes show selected value 15. Great, and now we need to register a listener for select event, so that whenever value of this select box changes, it should notify our parent component to update seconds to complete reactive variable. We have already registered listener for the select event inside of timeline item component. Let's copy this line from here and put it directly on our BaseSelect component. We're gonna have to update value of the seconds to complete reactive variable. So let's use proper variable name in here. And before checking this out in the browser, let's return null value as the initial value for seconds to complete variable. Inside of Vue DevTools, we can see that seconds to complete initially stores null value, and once we choose different option within select element, that value will be updated, as we can see in here, because now we're handling select event from BaseSelect component and appropriately update reactive variable seconds to complete. And then that reactive variable seconds to complete will be passed inside of selected prop to BaseSelect component. And those two variables will be always in sync, no matter how many times we will modify value of the select element. And additionally, whenever we click on the reset button, our selected property, as well as reactive variable seconds to complete, will get null value, which is expected. And this way we made our select box element fully controllable from activity item component. In order to display a list of activities on activities page, we use the for directive to iterate over activities array, which is currently located within the activities component. But since activities data is one of the main data in our application, it would be good to consolidate all main data in one place, to have only one source of truth where data can be modified and passed further to all components down the component tree, which may require that data. So in this lesson, we're going to move definition of activities array directly to app component. And this way we're gonna gather all main data in the application in our root component. And this root component will be our source of truth. Let's get started and open the activities component in the editor. From here, we're gonna extract this activities array, and let's move it to app component and place it right after timeline items constant. And then, in order to pass this activities array to the activities component, we're gonna use prop with the name activities and specify our constant name. And every time we pass new prop to the component, we always have to accept this prop. Let's use define props macro within the activities component and specify options for activities prop. This property will be required and its type will be array. Validation rules for this property we're gonna specify a bit later. And now let's also extract one more piece of data that is currently resides inside of activities item component, which is this period select options constant, which stores options for select box. And since this is a constant array which will never change, it doesn't make much sense to store it directly within this component. So let's take this whole array and move it inside of constants. We're gonna export new constant with the name period select options and paste our array. This way we try to gather all constant data inside of one place, which is this constants module. And in those components where this data will be needed, we're gonna import it explicitly. Let's write import statement for period select options constant from constants module like this. And since we have also renamed constant name, we need to specify correct name when we pass this constant array inside of options property of BaseSelect component. And now let's switch to working on validation. First of all, we're gonna write validation for activity property within activity item component. The validation logic for this property will be contained within isActivityValid function, which we will create soon. And for now, let's copy over import of another validation function from different file and place it inside of activity item component. And use this import to import isActivityValid validation function. And now let's go ahead and declare this function inside of validators.js. We'll create new function with the name isActivityValid, which accepts one parameter, which is activity we're going to validate. Export this function, and let's decide what validation rules should be applied to activity element. Initially, these rules will be simple because activity item is no more than just a simple string. And to check it, we're gonna use validator function isString to make sure it is really a string. And also this string should not be empty, so it should contain more than 0 characters. And since this line can be represented as an individual validation function, we can declare new function with the name isNotEmptyString. Passing our activity name inside and declare this function right down here. Let's paste that expression inside and use proper parameter name in here, valia. And now to check if our validation works, we're gonna switch over to app component, and inside of activities array, we're gonna add another entry at the end, which is supposed to make our validation fail. It will be an empty string. And since activity names should be non-empty strings, it should show validation error inside of browser console. So this activities array will be passed down to the activities component within activities prop. From there, every item from activities array is gonna go inside of activity item component within activity prop. And finally, validation logic for activity prop inside of activity item component should show a warning saying that custom validator check failed for prop activity. And indeed, we can see this warning in a console. And the last element of activities array does not show any name, since name in this case is empty. So our validation for activities array works perfectly. Let's revert changes we have done to activities array inside of app component and verify that after that there are no more warnings in a console. And finally, let's write validation logic for activities array inside of the activities component. We're gonna use a new function validate activities. Let's copy over import of validation function from another component, paste it inside of this component, rename the import, And in the validators.js file, we're gonna export another function validate activities, which will accept array of activities as its only parameter. And for this validation, we will stick to the same approach we have used to validate timeline items array. In here, we wrote separate function validate timeline items to validate the whole array of timeline items objects. And every object within this array we have checked by using another validation function, is timeline item valid. So in our current case, to validate array of activities, we're also going to iterate over this array by using every method. But in order to check individual elements from this array, we're gonna use another function, is activity valid. And this way it's gonna verify that all items within activities array are indeed valid activity names. And now let's do one final check in the browser. Firstly, we're gonna play around with select boxes to see if no warnings appear in the console. Everything looks good. And also let's try to navigate between pages to see if it will cause any errors or warnings. Looks like nothing was broken, and all data that is passed as props to different components is indeed valid.